In the oldest layers of Greek memory, before the shining temples of marble and the tidy stories written in schoolbooks, there were images that spoke louder than words. A wide, staring face, a mouth frozen open in a terrible grimace, teeth bared, tongue lolling, eyes bulging with an otherworldly fury, hair that is not hair at all, but a writhing nest of serpents, each one alive and each one poised to strike. To meet that face was to be undone. To see it carved on an ancient shield, on a temple's threshold, or stamped on a coin was to confront something older than language, a terror that could not be reasoned with, a warning, a curse, and a promise all at once. This was the Gorgon's face, and in time it would become inseparable from the name of Medusa. To the Greeks of the archaic world, Medusa was not first and foremost a story. She was a symbol, an image of such power that even centuries later, when the myths had settled into familiar patterns of heroes and quests, her face still spoke for itself. The earliest Gorgoneia, those stylized depictions of her head, stare out from pottery, shields, and temple stones with a kind of manic intensity. The mouth is stretched impossibly wide, the fangs are animal and human all at once, and the eyes seem to blaze directly at the viewer. These are not the features of a tragic maiden wronged by the gods. They are not even the features of a woman at all, in any recognizable sense. They are the mask of something primal, a threshold guardian whose very gaze is lethal. For those who lived in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, this was not art meant to be admired in peace. It was a weapon. The face of Medusa was used apotropaically, meaning its very ugliness, its very horror, was thought to ward off evil. Just as a snarling mask might frighten spirits away, the Medusa face was placed on shields to terrify enemies, on temple lintels to keep away intruders, on breastplates to deflect curses. It was less a character in a story and more a cosmic warning sign. Imagine yourself walking into a sacred place in that time. Before you even reach the altar, before the priest speaks a word, you see that wide face staring down at you from above the entrance. It tells you, in no uncertain terms, that this is not your world anymore. You are stepping into a place where the gods are near, and you must beware. The first function of Medusa was not to entertain, not to frighten children with a bedtime tale, but to mark the border between the ordinary and the sacred, the human and the divine. Over the centuries, storytellers would spin elaborate tales to explain her. They would give her a family, sisters named Stheno and Euryale, a fateful encounter with a hero named Perseus, and a curse laid down by the goddess Athena. But before all of this narrative scaffolding, the Greeks knew her through that one unforgettable image, the face that killed with a glance. And perhaps the most chilling thing about her is that she was not always confined to stories. There is reason to believe that the fear she embodies comes from something far older, something buried in the deepest layers of human imagination, where snakes, darkness, and death converge. Even the name Gorgon carries with it an echo of that primal fear. Scholars trace it to the Greek word gorgos, meaning dreadful or terrifying. She was not the Gorgon because of the details of her life, but because her entire being was terror made flesh. To call her Medusa was simply to give that terror a specific name. And this raises a question. Why snakes? Why did the Greeks imagine the crown of this monstrous being as a writhing tangle of serpents? Snakes had long been associated with death and transformation. They shed their skins, seemingly reborn. They emerged from holes in the earth as if they came from the underworld itself. They could kill swiftly with venom and yet were revered as guardians of tombs and temples. Across cultures, serpents carried both the power to protect and the power to destroy. To weave them into the very hair of the Gorgon was to fuse the image of woman and serpent into one, a hybrid whose appearance defied every category. She was no longer fully human, no longer simply animal. She was something that the mind struggled to process, and it is that struggle, what modern psychology might call the uncanny, that made her unforgettable. But to the Greeks, this was not abstract. To look upon her was to die. The myth would come later with Perseus and his mirrored shield, but even before his story solidified, the idea was there. The gaze of the Gorgon was not survivable. It was the embodiment of the most terrifying prospect, that to encounter the sacred face of death itself was to be undone, frozen, petrified into stone. Stone is the key. In Greece, stone was everywhere. Stone temples, stone statues, stone monuments to the dead. To be turned into stone was not merely to die, but to become a permanent object in the landscape, stripped of motion and voice, reduced to a cold and eternal reminder of mortality. To imagine a being whose very glance could render you into such a state was to give form to the deepest fear of all, the fear of annihilation coupled with the mockery of permanence. Yet Medusa was never just an emblem of destruction. From the very beginning, her image was also used as protection. A shield bearing her face was said to frighten enemies away, not merely kill them. A temple adorned with her features kept away spirits, not mortals. The paradox is already present. She is both monster and guardian, destroyer and protector. This duality will echo again and again in her story as we trace it through time, for Medusa has always been both less and more than she appears. Even the earliest myths hint at this ambiguity. Hesiod's Theogony, one of the oldest surviving accounts of Greek myth, names her as one of the three Gorgon sisters living on the edge of the known world. Hesiod claims that unlike her immortal sisters, Medusa alone was mortal. This is crucial because it makes her both kin to divinities and yet subject to death. She is a liminal figure, standing between the immortal and the mortal, embodying both divinity and vulnerability. Her mortality made her the target of Perseus's quest, but it also gave her story a human resonance absent from her sisters. In Hesiod's telling, when Perseus beheads Medusa, from her blood sprang two beings, the winged horse Pegasus and the warrior Chrysaor. This is not the end of a monster, but the beginning of new life. The paradox deepens. From the death of a dread creature come creatures of beauty and power. Even in the earliest Greek imagination, she is a womb of creation, as much as she is an agent of death. The Greeks could not seem to decide what to make of her, and perhaps that is why she endured. If she had been merely a monster to be slain, she might have been forgotten like so many others in the mythological bestiary. But her image persisted, adapted, reinterpreted. She became a face carved into shields, an emblem on coins, a guardian on temple pediments. Her story grew around her like vines around a stone. It is telling that when later artists sought to depict Perseus's triumph, they often focused less on the hero himself and more on the severed head he carried. Medusa's head, the Gorgonean, was thought to retain its power even after death. This makes her unique in Greek mythology. Most monsters once slain are simply gone. Medusa remains potent even in death, her gaze still able to turn enemies to stone. She is the only being in Greek myth whose head alone becomes a weapon, a tool wielded by heroes and even gods. This singularity sets her apart and ensures that her image, her presence, could never be buried. The first encounter with Medusa, then, is not simply a confrontation with a villain. It is a confrontation with the power of the image itself, with the way fear and fascination intertwine. She stares back at us from the artifacts of a vanished world, her wide eyes daring us to look and to understand. And as we peel back the layers of her myth, we begin to see that the Greeks themselves were engaged in the same struggle. Was she a monster to be slain, a goddess to be remembered, or a mask to be worn against evil? To answer that, we must trace her story not only in the myths told by poets, but in the stones, the statues, and the temples where her face still lingers. Her power was never confined to a single tale. It lived in the very landscape of Greece, in the marble and terracotta that bore her grin. The terror of Medusa was part of the architecture of the sacred world, and it is from that architecture, those first images, that we must move forward into the story of the impossible house she inhabits in the imagination, the house not of chicken legs, as with Baba Yaga, but of serpents and stone, a place where human and animal and divine collapse into one impossible image. If the first impression of Medusa is the terrible face that stares back at us from stone carvings and painted pottery, then the second is what crowns her head. A woman's body might still be recognizable in her early depictions, a face distorted into horror, but above that face the familiar is replaced by the impossible. Instead of hair, a nest of serpents twists and coils, alive and restless, an entire world of motion erupting from her skull. This impossible fusion is what marks her out even more than the fangs, the wide mouth, or the bulging eyes. It is what makes her image burn itself into memory, because it takes something deeply familiar, hair, the most ordinary and human of features, and replaces it with one of humanity's oldest fears. To understand why the Greeks gave Medusa her crown of snakes, it is worth remembering how powerful the symbol of the serpent was in the ancient world. In the Mediterranean, snakes were everywhere. They slipped through cracks in homes, they appeared suddenly in fields, they struck with little warning, and their venom could kill swiftly or slowly, depending on the species. They seemed to come from the ground itself, emerging from hidden holes, disappearing back into the earth as if they belonged to another world beneath the soil. This uncanny behavior made them perfect emblems of the underworld, of death, and of the mysteries that lie beyond human sight. But snakes were not only creatures of fear, they were also creatures of awe. In temple iconography, serpents often stood as protectors, guardians of sacred spaces. The Greeks associated them with healing as much as with poison. The god Asclepius, patron of medicine, carried a staff entwined with a serpent, a symbol that endures even today in the medical emblem. The snake's ability to shed its skin and appear renewed made it a symbol of rebirth and regeneration. It was both a creature of death and a creature of life, just as Medusa herself would embody destruction and creation at once. By placing snakes on her head, the Greeks created a figure that held all of these contradictions in one impossible image. She is beautiful and horrific, woman and beast, life-giver and life-taker. Her snakes are never still. In art, they writhe and twist around each other, their tongues flickering out, their scales rendered in careful detail. The effect is unsettling because it violates the expectation of what a human form should look like. The human face is meant to be framed by hair that flows, a sign of beauty and vitality. In Medusa, that sign is corrupted, replaced with living creatures that bite and constrict. The boundary between body and animal is dissolved, and we are forced to confront a vision of hybridity that feels deeply unnatural. Yet to call it unnatural is perhaps too hasty. For the Greeks, the world was already full of hybrid beings. Centaurs, half man and half horse, roamed their myths. Satyrs blended human features with the goat. Sirens combined women's faces with the wings of birds. The Gorgon snakes fit into this broader pattern of combining human and animal to create something that defied ordinary categories. What makes Medusa unique is that her hybridity is concentrated in the most personal and recognizable part of the human body, the face and head. While a centaur's fusion begins at the waist and a siren's body is clearly divided between bird and woman, Medusa's transformation erupts from the very site of identity. The face is how we know someone. It is what makes us human in the eyes of others. To distort it, to make it alien, is to unmake personhood itself. Medusa is no longer a woman with snakes in her hair. She is something else, something that cannot be neatly placed into human categories. The house of snakes that crowns her has another dimension as well. In the ancient Greek imagination, the head was the seat of power. When Perseus eventually defeats her, he does not carry away her body or her limbs. He carries only the head, because that is where her essence lies. The snakes that sprout from it are not decoration. They are extensions of her power, external signs of the inner force that radiates from her gaze. To face her is not simply to face a woman with venomous adornment, but to face an entire living crown of serpents whose every motion reminds the viewer that this being is surrounded by death and danger. The visual shock of the snake hair is also deeply tied to themes of wildness and untamed nature. In Greek thought, a woman's hair was often linked to her social identity. In ritual and in life, women's hair might be bound, braided, covered, or uncovered, depending on the circumstances. Loose hair could signify mourning, frenzy, or ritual ecstasy. To be unbound was to be outside the norms of civilized order. Medusa's hair takes that idea to an extreme. Not only is it unbound, it is no longer even hair. It is alive, uncontrollable, endlessly writhing. It is chaos erupting from her head, chaos made permanent. In her image, the Greeks crystallized the fear of the uncontained, of the feminine that could not be tamed or controlled. The snake hair also resonates with a deeper stratum of Mediterranean symbolism, the ancient mother goddess traditions that long predated classical Greece. Across the Near East and the Aegean, snake goddesses and serpent priestesses appear in Bronze Age art. The famous figurines from Minoan Crete, dating to around 1600 BCE, show women holding snakes in both hands, their bare breasts exposed, their posture commanding. These figures are not monsters. They are symbols of power, fertility, and divine authority. To see Medusa's snakes against this background is to suspect that her monstrous crown may be a distorted memory of a once sacred image, one that associated women with serpentine power not as a curse, but as a divine blessing. When Greek myth casts her as a horror, it may be drawing on a much older reverence that has been inverted, just as other powerful female figures of pre-Greek religion were reinterpreted as witches or monsters once the Olympian order took hold. But the snakes also work on a more immediate, visceral level. They trigger the human instinct to recoil. Even today, in a world where far fewer people encounter snakes in their daily lives, the sight of one coiled and ready to strike can freeze us in place. Studies suggest that humans are primed from birth to recognize snake-like shapes and respond with caution or fear. To crown a figure's head with snakes is therefore to place upon her the most universal and timeless of terrors. We are meant to look, and yet we are meant to turn away. The image compels and repels at the same time, which is precisely why it is so enduring. When Greek artists first began to standardize the image of the Gorgon, they experimented with different ways of rendering the snake hair. Sometimes it is shown as just a few snakes curling among strands of hair. Other times, it is a full nest, overwhelming the entire scalp, each snake large enough to be terrifying in its own right. The variations reveal the anxiety and fascination that the symbol provoked. There was no single way to depict it, because the point was not realism. The point was to convey an aura of horror, a feeling that here was something that violated the ordinary rules of nature. The House of Snakes was more than an aesthetic choice. It was a theological one. For the Greeks, who believed the gods walked among them and who saw divine power in storms, rivers, and the sea, to imagine a being with such an impossible crown was to acknowledge that the boundary between human and divine was porous, and that what lay beyond could be terrifying. Medusa was not simply a monster among monsters. Her snakes made her a reminder of the very instability of the world, a warning that beauty could curdle into horror, that the familiar could become strange in an instant. This impossible crown also connects Medusa to the realm of medicine and poison. In later myths, her blood is said to have two opposite qualities. From one side, it can kill instantly. From the other, it can heal and even bring life. The snakes on her head foreshadow this duality. They are creatures of venom, but also creatures associated with regeneration. Just as her head becomes a weapon and a tool in the hands of Perseus and Athena, so her snakes already signal that ambiguity, power that can harm or heal, destroy or protect. To gaze upon Medusa's snake crown is therefore to be drawn into a web of associations, the fear of death, the memory of ancient goddesses, the warning of wildness untamed, the dual nature of poison and medicine. It is not a simple monster's feature. It is an entire cosmology compressed into a single image. And so, when the Greeks told the story of Perseus cutting off her head, the focus was not simply on a hero defeating a villain. It was on a man confronting an impossible image and trying to survive. The mirror shield that Perseus uses is not just a clever trick. It is a recognition that to face Medusa directly, to look at the house of snakes and the eyes that blaze beneath it, is to risk annihilation. The only way to approach her is indirectly, mediated, refracted. She cannot be looked at straight on because the truth she represents is too overwhelming. This impossibility is what made her endure. Other monsters fade into the background of Greek myth, their stories told and then forgotten. But Medusa's snakes kept her alive in the imagination. They appeared not just in myth, but in art, in ritual, in architecture. They marked the boundaries of temples and tombs. They glared from shields carried into battle. They were not simply part of her, they were part of Greek life. And as we follow her story deeper, we will see that these snakes never truly left. They coiled their way into new interpretations, new symbols, new meanings, as poets and artists struggled to contain what she represented. Her snakes made her impossible, but they also made her unforgettable. They gave her the power to terrify across centuries, to be reimagined again and again in forms that reflected each age's anxieties and fascinations. And as we leave behind this first close look at the crown of serpents, we are drawn further into the myth itself, into the earliest Greek accounts of her origins, her family, and her place in the cosmic order, where the Gorgon first takes her place not just as an image, but as a character in the unfolding story of the gods and heroes. Long before marble temples gleamed in the Athenian sun, and long before playwrights filled theatres with polished tragedies, the stories of Greece lived in song. The poets who first spoke of Medusa did not write in books. They carried their verses in memory, reciting them in halls and festivals where communities gathered to hear the tales of gods, heroes, and monsters. In those earliest layers of Greek mythmaking, the Gorgon appears not as the polished figure we might imagine today, but as something raw, half-formed, and yet already unforgettable. The oldest surviving mention comes from Hesiod, writing in the 8th or early 7th century BCE. In his Theogony, a sprawling genealogy of gods and monsters, Hesiod places the Gorgons at the very edge of the known world. He names them as three sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, born of the primordial sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. They live, he tells us, beyond famed Oceanus at the world's edge, night-clad, where the clear-voiced Hesperides are. Already, they are creatures of the periphery, beings that dwell outside the world of ordinary mortals. But Hesiod singles Medusa out. Unlike her immortal sisters, she alone is mortal, doomed to die. This is significant. By making Medusa mortal, Hesiod creates the possibility of a story in which a hero can confront and overcome her. Without that mortality, she would remain like her sisters beyond reach, forever part of the background of cosmic terrors. Mortality humanizes her, even if only faintly. It makes her vulnerable, and that vulnerability is what allows Perseus' tale to exist. In the same poem, Hesiod also tells us what happened after her death. From her severed neck sprang two remarkable figures. the winged horse Pegasus, and a warrior named Chrysa, whose name means golden sword. The birth of these beings from her blood is a detail of enormous importance. It means that Medusa is not just a destroyer, not just a monster to be slain. She is also a mother, a source of creation, even in death. Her role is dual, both terrifying and generative. Hesiod does not give us a backstory of curses or temples. He does not tell us how she came to have snakes for hair or why her gaze turns men to stone. But he gives us this paradox. From the death of a dread being comes new life. What we see in Hesiod is an image that is still closer to ritual and symbol than to story. Medusa is an entry in a cosmic catalogue, a name on a long list of strange children born from primordial deities. Yet even here, she refuses to be reduced to a footnote. Her mortality, her offspring, and her place among the great terrors mark her as a figure of unique interest. The first storytellers clearly sensed that she carried something more than the other monsters. A generation later, Homer gives us another glimpse. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus travels to the land of the dead, he fears that Persephone will send against him the Gorgon's head, that dread monster of the underworld. Here, the Gorgon is not a character in a narrative, but an emblem of sheer terror, a presence so dreadful that even heroes fear to face it. Homer does not name Medusa specifically, but the singular phrasing suggests that the head of the Gorgon was already a familiar image to his audience. By the time of the Odyssey, the Greeks knew what it meant to invoke the Gorgon, the ultimate horror, a vision of death that cannot be resisted. In both Hesiod and Homer, then, we see the earliest outlines of Medusa's mythic presence. She is not yet the tragic maiden punished by Athena, nor the beautiful woman transformed into a monster. She is not yet the object of Perseus's quest, complete with divine gifts and clever tricks. Instead, she is raw terror, a primal force, something that appears on the horizon of Greek imagination as both deadly and strangely fertile. The first storytellers do not tame her into a neat moral parable. They present her as she is, a monster whose very image is overwhelming. This rawness reflects the world in which these poets lived. The archaic period of Greece was a time of transition. Communities were still emerging from the long shadow of the so-called Dark Age, when writing had been lost and memory carried culture forward. The oral tradition was strong, and myth was less a fixed canon than a living current, shifting with each telling. In this fluid environment, Medusa's story was not locked down. It was a set of images: snakes, petrifying eyes, a severed head, a miraculous birth that poets could arrange in different ways. Archaeology confirms this. The earliest visual depictions of the Gorgon, appearing around the same time as Hesiod and Homer, do not always match the later, more familiar image. On pottery and temple decorations, the Gorgon's face is exaggerated, almost cartoonish by modern standards. The tongue lolls out, the eyes bulge, the teeth are tusk-like. Sometimes she has wings, sometimes not. Sometimes the snakes are prominent, other times they are barely suggested. What remains constant is the stare. The artists of the archaic world understood that the power of Medusa was not in her body, but in her face, in the direct confrontation between viewer and image. The Gorgonean, the mask of Medusa's head, was already becoming a symbol independent of her story, used to ward off evil or intimidate foes. This independence of image from narrative is crucial. It shows us that in the archaic period, Medusa was not confined to the logic of myth. She was not a character trapped in a single tale. She was a free-floating emblem, available to be invoked wherever fear, protection, or awe were needed. Her head could appear on a shield in battle, on a temple to mark sacred space, or in a poem to signal the most dreadful of visions. The storytellers did not invent her, they inherited her, and they began the long process of weaving her into the fabric of Greek myth. The role of the poet in this process cannot be overstated. In a world without written texts, the poet, was not simply an entertainer. He was a keeper of memory, a transmitter of culture, and a shaper of meaning. When Hesiod gave Medusa sisters and parents, he was not just inventing details. He was situating her in the cosmic order, giving her a place in the genealogy that stretched from chaos to Zeus. When Homer invoked the Gorgon's head in the Odyssey, he was not describing a scene, but summoning a shared cultural image, trusting that his audience would feel its weight without needing explanation. The first storytellers did not invent Medusa. They curated her, shaping an image already laden with meaning into forms that would resonate with their audiences. It is tempting to look back from later centuries, when Medusa's myth was more fully developed, and imagine that her story was always as we know it. But in the archaic world, it was not. What we see instead is a slow crystallization. A monster on the edge of the world becomes the focus of a hero's quest. A terrifying head glimpsed in the underworld becomes a weapon in divine hands. A mask on a shield becomes a tragic maiden in a temple. Each layer is added by storytellers, artists, and communities who needed Medusa to mean something specific to them. The first storytellers were not only shaping entertainment, they were shaping the boundaries of fear and identity. To tell of Medusa was to speak of what lay beyond the safe world of the polis, the ordered city. She belonged to the wild edges, the places where chaos reigned. In a society that prized order, balance, and measure, Medusa was the image of excess, of the overwhelming. She marked the line between civilization and wilderness, between human and inhuman. To tell her story was to remind listeners of that line and of the danger of crossing it. As the archaic period unfolded, these images began to solidify into more recognizable myths. Vast painters and sculptors showed Perseus sneaking up on Medusa, sword in hand, shield raised. Poets elaborated on the gifts he received from the gods: Hermes' winged sandals, Athena's polished shield, Hades' helm of invisibility. These were details meant to highlight both the danger of the Gorgon and the divine sanction of the hero. The first storytellers were setting the stage for what would become one of the most enduring myths of Greek antiquity, the slaying of Medusa by Perseus. But in these earliest accounts, the story was not yet polished into the form we know. The details varied, the symbols loomed larger than the narrative, and the emphasis remained on the overwhelming terror of the Gorgon's face. It is as if the Greeks themselves were still trying to process what Medusa meant. Was she simply another monster, like the Hydra or the Chimera, to be defeated by a hero? Or was she something more, something whose power lingered even after her death? The storytellers of the archaic period did not give us final answers. They gave us fragments, images, and hints. What they gave us above all was a foundation. They placed Medusa in the genealogy of gods. They gave her a place on the edge of the world, and they began the process of turning her from an image into a story. From these beginnings, later generations would build the more elaborate myths we know today. But it is worth remembering that for the first storytellers, Medusa was not neat or tragic or even fully human. She was a face, a stare, a head that killed, and a blood that birthed. She was dread incarnate, and that dread was enough to capture the imagination of a culture that was still finding its voice. And as we move forward from these first tellings, the image of Medusa will not fade. Instead, it will grow sharper, taking on new layers of meaning as poets and artists make her the centerpiece of one of the great heroic tales of Greece, the quest of Perseus and the death of the monster who was never just a monster at all. When the Greeks began to shape their chaotic inheritance of symbols into structured myths, Medusa became something new. She was no longer only a face that stared back from temple stones or a name buried in Hesiod's genealogies. She was given a story, and not just any story, but one of the great heroic quests of the Greek imagination. If the first storytellers had placed her at the edges of the world, Then the poets of the next generation sent a hero to those edges to confront her. That hero was Perseus, and through him, Medusa would become immortal in an entirely different way. The myth of Perseus belongs to a very old pattern in Greek storytelling. The young man, born into difficulty, threatened before he can grow, protected by divine favor, and destined to prove himself by achieving the impossible. His tale begins not with Medusa, but with a prophecy. Acrisius, king of Argos, is told that he will be killed by the son of his daughter Danae. Terrified of his fate, he locks Danae away in a bronze chamber beneath the earth so that no man can reach her. But prophecies in Greek myth are never so easily thwarted. Zeus himself comes to her, descending not in human form, but as a shower of golden light. From this union, Perseus is born. Acrisius, unwilling to kill his grandson outright but still desperate to avoid the prophecy, places mother and child in a wooden chest and casts them into the sea. It is the same motif that appears across mythologies, the vulnerable child set adrift, only to survive by divine favor. The chest washes ashore on the island of Seriphos, where the fisherman Dictys takes them in. Perseus grows to manhood there, far from Argos, under the protection of the kindly Dictys. But Seriphos is ruled by Dictys' brother, King Polydectes, and it is Polydectes' desire that sets the stage for the quest. Polydectes covets Danae, but Perseus, grown into a proud and protective son, will not allow it. The king schemes to rid himself of this inconvenient young man. Announcing that he wishes to marry another woman, he demands that every man on the island bring him a horse as a wedding gift. Perseus has no horse to give, and in his desperation boasts that he could just as easily fetch the head of the Gorgon. Polydectes seizes on the boast, and the impossible task is set. If Perseus cannot deliver, he will be disgraced. If he tries and fails, he will be destroyed. Either way, Polydectes is rid of him. At this point, the gods intervene, as they so often do when a mortal is about to step into the realm of myth. Hermes, the trickster messenger, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, take pity on the youth and provide him with guidance. In different tellings, they offer him different gifts: a polished bronze shield to serve as a mirror, a curved sword sharp enough to sever the Gorgon's neck, winged sandals to fly across the world, a helm of invisibility to hide him from danger, and a special pouch to carry the severed head. What matters is not the exact inventory, but the pattern. Perseus cannot face Medusa as an ordinary man. He must be equipped with divine tools, each one carefully chosen to counter the impossible danger of the Gorgon. This part of the myth reflects the gravity of what Perseus is about to do. The Greeks were not content to let him wander into the Gorgon's lair armed only with courage. To face Medusa required the best gifts of the gods themselves. The story is making a point. No mortal could look upon that face and live unless shielded and aided by divine wisdom. Guided by Hermes and Athena, Perseus first seeks out the Graeae, the three ancient sisters who share a single eye between them. They are keepers of secret knowledge, dwelling at the far reaches of the earth. Perseus waits until they pass the eye between them, then snatches it and refuses to return it until they tell him where to find the nymphs who guard the divine treasures he needs. The Graeae, powerless without their shared sight, yield to him. From the nymphs, Perseus receives the winged sandals, the magical pouch, and the helm of invisibility. Only then, fully armed and divinely sanctioned, does he set out to confront Medusa. In the Greek imagination, the Gorgons lived at the edge of the world, beyond Oceanus, in a place where night and day brushed against each other. To reach them was already to step outside the boundaries of the ordinary world. This geography is not about maps, but about states of being. To reach the Gorgon is to travel into the realm of death, where the laws of life no longer hold. Perseus's journey is not just a physical voyage, but a symbolic descent to the very margins of existence. When he arrives, he finds Medusa and her sisters sleeping. This detail appears in several versions of the myth, and it is telling. The Gorgon awake is unfaceable, her gaze cannot be met. Only by catching her unawares does Perseus have a chance. Creeping forward, he does not dare look directly at her. Instead, he raises Athena's polished shield before him and watches her reflection. The mirror becomes his salvation. Step by step he approaches, sword in hand, until he is close enough. With a single stroke he severs her head. The moment is explosive. From her neck burst Pegasus and Chrysaea, children she bore by Poseidon, now released into the world. The sleeping sisters wake, shrieking in rage, but Perseus is already fleeing, the head secured in his pouch, the helm of invisibility hiding him from their pursuit. This scene, repeated in vase paintings and retellings for centuries, is one of the most iconic in Greek mythology. It captures not just the drama of heroism, but the essence of the Medusa myth. To face her is impossible. To kill her requires trickery, divine aid, and the refusal to meet her gaze directly. Perseus does not defeat her in open combat. He defeats her through indirection, through reflection, through distance. It is a victory that acknowledges her power even in the moment of her death. What makes this story remarkable is that Medusa's potency does not end when she is slain. Unlike other monsters whose death ends their threat, Medusa's head retains its power. Perseus carries it with him, using it to petrify enemies along the way. When he rescues Andromeda from the sea monster, he uses the Gorgon's head to turn the beast to stone. When he returns to Seriphos, he reveals it to Polydectes and his courtiers, freezing them where they stand. The head becomes his ultimate weapon, a trophy that is not just a symbol of victory, but a source of continuing power. Eventually, Perseus gives the head to Athena, who places it on her shield, the Aegis. There it remains, blazing from the goddess's breastplate in countless depictions, a permanent emblem of divine terror. In this way, Medusa transcends her own story. She becomes part of the iconography of Athena, woven into the fabric of Greek religion and art. Her face, once a free-floating symbol of dread, is now anchored to one of the greatest Olympian deities. This outcome is unique in Greek mythology. No other monster retains power after death in the same way. The Hydra's heads are cut off, the Chimera is slain, the Nemean lion's hide becomes armor, but none of these creatures' essence persists as a living force. Only Medusa remains potent, her head still deadly, her gaze still petrifying. This is why the myth of Perseus is not simply a tale of heroism, it is a tale of containment. Perseus does not destroy Medusa so much as he transfers her power, harnessing it for his own purposes, and then delivering it into the hands of Athena. The Gorgon is too powerful to be erased. She must be redirected, her terror placed into the service of order and the Olympian gods. In this, we see a deeper meaning. The Greeks were telling not just of a hero and a monster, but of the taming of chaos. Medusa, with her impossible face and her house of snakes, represented the raw, untamed forces of death and fear. Perseus, armed by the gods, represents the order of Olympus, the human community upheld by divine sanction. The slaying of Medusa is a mythic act of control, the harnessing of dread into the service of the civilized world. Her head on Athena's shield is the perfect symbol, the wild terror of the Gorgon, subordinated to the rational war goddess, now wielded as a weapon of state and city. But there is another layer to this story, one that complicates the simple heroic narrative. For in later retellings, the myth of Perseus and Medusa takes on a new dimension. Medusa is no longer just a monster born of primordial parents. She becomes a woman cursed. Ovid, writing in Roman times, tells the story that would become one of the most enduring versions. According to him, Medusa was once a beautiful maiden desired by Poseidon. When the god assaulted her in Athena's temple, the goddess, enraged not at the aggressor but at the victim, punished Medusa by transforming her hair into snakes and making her face so terrible that it turned all who looked upon her to stone. In Ovid's retelling, the slaying of Medusa by Perseus is no longer simply the triumph of hero over monster. It is also the tragedy of a woman punished by the gods, cursed into monstrosity, and then killed for that monstrosity. The story becomes layered with injustice, with the cruelty of divine power, and with the vulnerability of mortals caught between gods and heroes. This later version reveals how flexible Medusa's myth had become. For the Greeks of the archaic period, she was raw terror, a face that petrified. For the classical poets, she was a monster slain by a hero. For the Romans, she could be recast as a victim, her death not just a heroic triumph, but a tragic necessity. Perseus's victory remains, but the meaning of that victory shifts, becoming not only about the taming of chaos, but also about the cost of divine cruelty and human suffering. The death of Medusa, then, is not the end of her story. It is the moment that propels her into new forms, new interpretations. Her head remains potent, her image remains everywhere, and her myth continues to evolve. Perseus may carry her head back across the seas, but the power it represents cannot be contained by one man, one goddess, or even one culture. It will survive across centuries, reborn in new ways, always staring back at us with that impossible gaze. And as we follow the path of that severed head, we begin to see how Medusa's image spread beyond myth into art, architecture, and ritual. Her face carved in stone, not just as a record of Perseus's victory, but as a living symbol placed on temples, shields, and statues. The death of the monster is only the beginning of her strange immortality. When Perseus cut through the impossible neck of Medusa, he did not simply slay another beast of the mythic wilds, he created something unprecedented. Most monsters, once killed, became little more than trophies or stories, lion skins to be worn, hydra heads to be burned, carcasses to prove a hero's might. But Medusa was different. Death did not erase her power. It condensed it, concentrated it into the severed head that Perseus carried away in his pouch. This object, more than the story of the chase or the swing of the sword, is what gave her myth its lasting shape. For the head of Medusa was not just a trophy, it was a weapon in its own right, one that retained all the dread power of its living body. The Greeks called this head the Gorgon. Even in antiquity, the term referred not only to the actual head in the myth, but to the image of it used in art and ritual. It was both an artifact within the story and a symbol in the real world, and the line between the two was thin. To speak of the Gorgon was to speak of the deadly mask of horror that could turn men to stone, whether carved in marble or carried by Perseus. The first use of the head, according to the myth, comes almost immediately after Perseus's escape from the Gorgon sisters. As he flees, he encounters Atlas, the titan condemned to hold up the heavens. When Atlas refuses him shelter, Perseus reveals the head, and Atlas is transformed into the great mountain that still bears his name. This is a striking moment. The power of the head is not diminished by distance from its body. It acts instantly, petrifying even a titan. The message is clear. Medusa's gaze is absolute, extending beyond life, beyond death, beyond mortal and divine. On his journey home, Perseus' use of the head becomes even more dramatic. When he finds Andromeda chained to the rocks, a sacrifice to a sea monster sent by Poseidon, Perseus confronts the beast with the Gorgon. The monster turns to stone, and Andromeda is saved. Here, the head becomes a tool of salvation, a weapon not of slaughter, but of rescue. Medusa, slain and decapitated, is nonetheless the indirect agent of another woman's liberation. Later, when Perseus returns to Seriphos and confronts Polydectes, the king who had sent him on the impossible quest, the head delivers justice. Perseus enters the court where Polydectes and his followers sit, and without a word he raises the Gorgon. Instantly, the hall is filled with stone figures, each man frozen in the posture of his last breath. The tyrant is undone, not by Perseus's sword, but by the head of the very creature Polydectes had mocked him for claiming he could defeat. Medusa, in death, becomes the agent of vengeance, her power turned against the one who had hoped to destroy Perseus and enslave his mother. It is at this moment that Perseus' story shifts. He has proven himself, not only by surviving his quest, but by bringing back a weapon that even the gods respect. He does not keep it for himself. He delivers it to Athena, who mounts it on her aegis, the shield that blazes in countless depictions of the goddess. From then on, the Gorgonean is inseparable from her iconography. The goddess of wisdom and war carries the ultimate emblem of dread, a face that terrifies enemies before a battle is even fought. This transfer of the head from Perseus to Athena is crucial. It shows us that Medusa's power was too great to remain in the hands of a mortal hero. It belonged to the divine. Just as fire stolen from the gods in the myth of Prometheus must ultimately remain under divine control, so too must the petrifying gaze of the Gorgon be wielded only by a goddess. For Athena, the head is not simply a weapon, it is a symbol of her role as the protector of the polis, the city-state, a guardian of boundaries. When enemies approach, they do not just face spears and walls, they face the eternal glare of the Gorgon, now pressed into service of divine order. The Gorgonean appears again and again in Greek art after this point, not just on Athena's aegis, but on shields, armor, coins, and temples. Soldiers painted it on their breastplates to terrify their opponents. Families carved it above doorways to ward off spirits. Sculptors placed it on the pediments of sacred buildings to keep the profane at bay. The severed head, once part of a mythic story, became part of daily life. It was a symbol that everyone recognized, a reminder that fear itself could be harnessed, directed, and used as protection. This dual use, as a weapon in myth and as a symbol in reality, reveals the depth of the Gorgonean's power. It was not simply about violence, it was about boundaries. To display Medusa's head was to mark a threshold between inside and outside, sacred and profane, safe and dangerous. To cross under the gaze of the Gorgon was to accept that you were entering a space watched by powers beyond your control. The severed head was not only a relic of Perseus's quest, it was a living part of Greek religion and culture. What makes this transformation extraordinary is that the Greeks did not discard the horror of Medusa when they adopted her image, they embraced it. The head on Athena's shield is not beautified or softened, it is grotesque, its tongue lolling, its eyes wide, its snakes writhing. The Greeks understood that fear could be protective. Just as a lion's skin made Heracles invincible, just as thunderbolts marked Zeus's wrath, the Gorgon's head was a weapon that worked precisely because it terrified. At the same time, the Gorgonean carried layers of ambiguity. It was both apotropaic and destructive. It could protect a home, but it could also annihilate an enemy. In this sense, it mirrored the dual nature of Medusa herself, guardian and destroyer, curse and blessing. Even in death, her myth carried contradictions. She was a monster slain, but also a power preserved, her essence carried forward by gods and mortals alike. We should not underestimate how unusual this is in the Greek mythic imagination. Most monsters serve as obstacles for heroes. Once overcome, their purpose is complete. Medusa breaks this mold. Her severed head has a second life, one that proves more enduring than the tale of her slaying. In some ways, the hero fades while the monster remains. Perseus completes his quest, marries Andromeda, and eventually fades into the genealogies of kings. But Medusa's head, blazing from Athena's aegis, continues to glare down from temples and statues for centuries. The hero vanishes, the monster endures. Later, poets and philosophers recognized this strange reversal. Some saw it as a symbol of justice, the monstrous turned against tyranny. Others saw it as a warning that fear and violence, once unleashed, can never be fully contained. Even after Perseus has handed the head to Athena, it remains dangerous. In one version of the myth, when Perseus accidentally reveals it in front of his grandfather Acrisius, the prophecy comes true. Acrisius is struck dead, fulfilling the oracle he had tried to escape. The head's power cannot be controlled, not even by the hero who carries it. It is a reminder that dread, once born, cannot be domesticated. It will always find its mark. This theme, that Medusa's head remains potent even in death, sets her apart from all other monsters of Greek lore. It also helps explain why her image was so widespread in Greek society. She was not simply an enemy to be feared, but a power to be invoked. Her severed head became a paradoxical kind of blessing. To wear her face was to carry dread, but to display it was to turn that dread outward, onto others. In this way, the Greeks transformed her from a figure of chaos into an emblem of order, but without stripping away the raw terror that made her unique. The severed head also speaks to deeper anxieties about the body and the face. In Greek culture, the face was the seat of identity, the part of the body that revealed character and essence. To cut off a head was to obliterate identity, to reduce a person to an object. And yet, in Medusa's case, the opposite occurs. Her severed head becomes more powerful than her living body. It is as though her identity was always located there, in the impossible gaze that kills, and death only purified it, stripping away the rest. She becomes distilled terror, a face without a body, an image without context, a mask that kills. In this sense, the myth of the severed head anticipates a theme that will haunt her story for millennia, the power of the image itself. Medusa does not need to live to terrify. The sight of her face, whether in myth or on a shield, is enough. She is an archetype of visual power, a reminder that images can kill, that to look is not always safe. The Greeks, who decorated their world with her face, understood this instinctively. They turned her image into one of the most enduring symbols of their culture, but they never forgot that it was dangerous. So the story of the severed head is not simply the end of Medusa, it is the beginning of her afterlife. Once severed, she becomes more present, more visible, more potent. Her face spreads across Greece, from the shields of warriors to the stones of temples, from the myths of poets to the daily life of citizens. Perseus may have claimed the glory of the kill, but it is Medusa who remains, her head carried into battle by Athena, her image carved into the very architecture of the sacred world. And as we follow this strange second life, we begin to see that the head is not only a weapon, it is a mystery. How can a monster remain potent after death? How can horror become protection? How can the face of dread become the emblem of a goddess? These questions take us deeper into the next stage of Medusa's myth, into the stories that sought to explain not just what she was, but how she came to be. Stories that shifted her from faceless monster to tragic figure, cursed by the gods and forever caught between the sacred and the profane. By the time the Greeks had fully absorbed Medusa into their mythic imagination, her image was no longer only that of a primordial monster lurking at the edges of the world. She became something more unsettling, something closer to human, a figure with a story rather than just a face. The shift happened gradually as poets and storytellers began to ask not just what she was, but why. How does a woman come to wear a crown of snakes? How does she come to possess a gaze that can turn flesh to stone? Myths rarely leave such mysteries unexplained for long. To the Greeks, there had to be an origin, a moment when an ordinary being became the extraordinary figure who haunts their imagination. Out of that need was born the tale of a curse. The most famous version of this transformation comes from the Roman poet Ovid, writing in his Metamorphoses during the 1st century CE. His retelling is late, but it would come to dominate the way later ages imagined Medusa. According to Ovid, Medusa was not always monstrous. She was once a beautiful maiden, so beautiful that Poseidon, lord of the sea, desired her. In one of the most brutal scenes of the myth, he assaults her within the sacred temple of Athena. The violation is shocking not only for its violence but for its location. To profane the sanctuary of a goddess was an act of sacrilege, one that demanded punishment. Yet it was not Poseidon who suffered Athena's wrath. It was Medusa. Ovid tells us that Athena, enraged by the desecration of her temple, punished the maiden by transforming her hair into writhing serpents and making her face so terrible that all who gazed upon it would be petrified. In this telling, the Gorgon is not born of primordial deities or placed on the edge of the world by Hesiod's cosmic catalogue. She is created in a single divine act of vengeance, a woman cursed not for her crime, but for her victimhood. The story is brutal in its logic. Medusa suffers twice, first at the hands of Poseidon and then at the hands of Athena. This version, tragic and deeply unjust, has captivated readers for centuries. It transforms Medusa from a monster into a victim, from a horror into a figure of pathos. Her monstrousness is no longer innate but imposed, a punishment for circumstances beyond her control. When Perseus slays her, it is not merely the triumph of a hero over a beast. It is the killing of a woman who has already suffered at the hands of gods. The story darkens, shifting from mythic triumph to divine cruelty. But why did this version emerge, and why did it take such a hold on the imagination of later ages? To answer that, we must look at the cultural context. In Ovid's Rome, stories of transformation, of mortals punished by gods, filled the Metamorphoses. The poem is a vast collection of tales in which men and women are turned into trees, birds, rivers, and stones, often as punishment, sometimes as rescue. Medusa's transformation fit perfectly into this pattern. It also reflected a long-standing tendency in myth to explain monstrous figures as the result of divine wrath. The Greeks had other examples. Lamia, once a queen, cursed by Hera to become a child-eating demon. The Harpies, daughters of a sea god, turned into winged monsters. In this tradition, the monstrous is not born but made, the product of divine punishment or cosmic accident. Medusa, once imagined as primordial, was recast to fit this narrative frame. The story also reflects a tension within Greek thought about women, beauty, and power. A beautiful woman was both admired and feared. Her beauty could attract gods and men alike, often to her ruin. To be desired by a god was not always a blessing. In many myths, it was a prelude to suffering. Medusa's beauty, in Ovid's telling, becomes the root of her downfall. It draws Poseidon's lust and Athena's wrath. Her transformation into a monster is not a stripping away of her beauty, but a horrific exaggeration of it, turning the very feature that once drew admiration into a weapon of destruction. There is also the matter of Athena's role. Why would the goddess of wisdom and justice punish the victim instead of the aggressor? Some see in this a reflection of the harshness of divine justice in Greek myth, where mortals are punished not for guilt, but for transgression, even unwilling transgression. Others interpret it as a symbolic act. Athena, a virgin goddess who embodies the rational order of the polis, rejects the violation of her temple not by striking Poseidon, too powerful, too essential to the cosmic order, but by transforming Medusa into something that embodies the violation itself. In this reading, Medusa becomes a living reminder of Athena's authority, her monstrousness a warning of what happens when boundaries are crossed. Yet even in this harsh version, there is an unexpected twist. Medusa's curse also gives her power. She becomes untouchable, lethal to anyone who dares to look at her. The punishment is also an empowerment, albeit one that isolates and dooms her. She cannot live among mortals, she cannot be loved or approached, but she cannot be harmed either until Perseus finds the trick of the mirror shield. This duality, victim and weapon, cursed and empowered, is what gives the myth its enduring resonance. It is not a simple tale of punishment, but a complex meditation on power, fear, and injustice. Earlier Greek sources do not explicitly tell this story, but there are hints of it. Some vase paintings from the 5th century BCE show Medusa not as a grotesque monster, but as a beautiful woman with serpentine hair, her features still recognizable and even alluring. This suggests that the idea of Medusa as once beautiful was already circulating before Ovid codified it. The curse story may have been one of many explanations offered to account for her terrifying image.
By the Roman period, it had become dominant, perhaps because it fit so neatly into the Roman fascination with tragedy and transformation. Once this version took hold, it altered the way Medusa was understood. She was no longer merely a guardian image or a monster of the edges. She was a woman wronged, her horror the result of divine injustice. This shift would echo down through the centuries, making her a figure of sympathy as well as fear. Renaissance artists painted her with traces of beauty still visible, her face caught between allure and terror. Modern readers, influenced by feminist interpretations, see in her story the perfect emblem of how patriarchal myths punish female sexuality and turn victims into villains. The birth of the Gorgon myth, then, is not a single moment, but a layering of interpretations. Hesiod gave us a primordial monster, Homer a dreadhead in the underworld, Ovid a woman cursed. Each version tells us something about the society that produced it. For the archaic Greeks, Medusa embodied raw terror, the chaos of the edges. For the classical Greeks, she was an obstacle for a hero, a test of divine favor. For the Romans, she was a tragic figure, punished unjustly and transformed into a symbol of divine wrath. In each retelling, she reflects the anxieties of the age, about boundaries, about beauty, about the power of gods over mortals. This is what makes her story so enduring. Medusa is never fixed. She is always being remade, reinterpreted, reimagined. The curse version gave her depth, turning her from a simple monster into a layered figure of fear, power, and sorrow. It also ensured that her story would continue to resonate, because it is not only about gods and heroes, but about injustice, suffering, and the strange empowerment that can come from pain. And as her myth took on this new shape, her image spread even further. The Gorgonion was no longer only a mask of horror, it became a reminder of divine punishment, a marker of sacred space, a guardian on temples, coins, and statues. Medusa, cursed and slain, was everywhere in the ancient world, her face staring back from stone and bronze, daring mortals to look and warning them of the power of the gods. When the myths of Greece moved from the voices of poets to the stones of the city, Medusa's presence only deepened. Her story was told in song and recitation, but her face was carved into marble, painted onto terracotta, cast into bronze, and built into the very architecture of sacred places. Nowhere is this more striking than in Athens, the city of Athena, where the Gorgon's image became inseparable from the identity of temples and sanctuaries. To stand before one of those buildings was to meet her gaze before meeting the gods. The Greek temple was not only a place for ritual, but a statement of power, a declaration that here the divine was present. Its columns, pediments, and sculptures did more than decorate. They announced the character of the deity within. For Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, the Gorgon's head was the perfect emblem. It was mounted on her shield, the aegis, and so by extension it became part of the city she guarded. But the use of Medusa's face in temple architecture was not confined to shields and statues. It was built into the very stones themselves, carved as guardians on lintels, doorways, and pediments. One of the most striking examples comes from the early temple on the Acropolis, often called the Hecatompedon, built in the 6th century BCE. The surviving fragments show enormous Gorgon figures carved into the pediments. These were not small decorative details tucked into corners,
They were colossal presences, filling the triangular space above the entrance with their wide eyes, lolling tongues, and serpent hair. To approach the temple was to come under their gaze, to be reminded before stepping across the threshold that this was not the realm of mortals. The gods were near, and they demanded respect. What is remarkable about these early temple Gorgons is their sheer scale. They are not hidden, not subtle, but overwhelming. Their bodies, sometimes shown in the archaic running pose with bent knees and outstretched arms, loom across the entire pediment. They are grotesque, exaggerated, almost cartoonish by later standards, but their purpose was not realism. It was intimidation. To look up and see those staring eyes was to feel small, vulnerable, and watched. This was the function of the Gorgonean magnified to architectural scale. It was not only on shields or coins carried by individuals, but on the great communal buildings of the city, protecting everyone who entered. As temple architecture developed in the classical period, the style of Gorgon depictions changed. The exaggerated features softened. Instead of grotesque tongues and bulging eyes, the Gorgon's head became more symmetrical, sometimes even beautiful, with only the snakes to mark her as monstrous. On the Parthenon itself, built in the 5th century BCE, Athena's statue by Phidias bore the Gorgon's head on her breastplate, but rendered with elegance rather than horror. The shift reflects a broader trend in Greek art, the move from the archaic love of raw intimidation to the classical ideal of balance and harmony. Yet the presence of the Gorgon remained constant. Even when beautified, her face was there, watching. This persistence shows us something crucial about Greek religion. The Greeks did not imagine their gods as safe or comforting in the modern sense. They were powerful, dangerous beings whose favor was sought but never guaranteed. To enter a temple was to enter their space, and the architecture reminded worshippers of that. The Gorgon's face, staring from the stone, was both guardian and warning. It protected the temple from intruders, but it also reminded the worshipper that to step inside was to risk being seen by the divine. The same power that turned enemies to stone could, in another context, enforce reverence and humility. The Athenians were especially invested in this imagery because of their devotion to Athena. As the goddess who bore the Gorgon's head on her aegis, she embodied the paradox of wisdom armed with dread. To carve Medusa's face into her temples was to extend her protection to the city itself. The Acropolis became a fortress not only of stone walls, but of divine terror, with the Gorgon's face glaring out across the land. Coins minted in Athens and other Greek cities also carried the Gorgonean, spreading her image far beyond temple walls. A coin bearing the Gorgon's head was both currency and talisman, a portable piece of divine power. It reminded those who carried it that they lived under the watch of the gods, and that the same power that could terrify enemies in battle also flowed through their daily lives. The face in stone was not confined to sanctuaries, it circulated in the hands of citizens, merchants and soldiers. In Athens, the Gorgon's presence was woven into civic identity. The city was proud of its goddess, proud of its role as a center of wisdom, power and culture. Yet at the heart of that identity was the face of dread. The Athenians did not deny fear, they sanctified it, harnessed it, turned it outward. To build a temple with Medusa's face at its front was to say, this city is protected, this space is sacred, and those who would profane it will meet the gaze that no mortal can withstand. The use of Medusa in stone also tells us something about how the Greeks understood images. For them, an image was not just a representation, it carried power. To carve the Gorgon into a temple was not symbolic in the modern sense, it was believed to have real apotropaic force. The stone face was thought to actively ward off evil, just as a Gorgonean on a shield actively terrified enemies. This is why the features remained exaggerated for so long, even when artistic taste shifted. The grotesque worked because it provoked a visceral reaction. Even softened in later art, the Gorgon's face retained that aura. What began as a monstrous image at the edge of the world had now become central to the very heart of Greek religion and civic life. Medusa, slain by Perseus, cursed by Athena, was nonetheless carved into the temples of Athena herself, her face immortalized in marble. The paradox is striking. The goddess who cursed her also carried her image, and the city that worshipped that goddess displayed the Gorgon at its most sacred sites. In this tension, we glimpse the complexity of Greek myth. Medusa was not erased by her death or her curse. She was assimilated, her power reinterpreted, her face set in stone for all to see. For the Athenians, then, to approach the temple was to meet Medusa first. Before the statue of the goddess, before the altar of sacrifice, before the prayers, there was the face of the Gorgon staring down. It was a face that demanded reverence, that reminded the worshipper of the thin line between mortal and divine, safe and sacred. It was a face that said, "You are entering a space of power, and you must beware." And as her face spread across the temples of Greece, Medusa ceased to be merely the monster slain by Perseus. She became a symbol of the sacred itself, the stone guardian who marked the threshold between the human and the divine. To see her carved into the marble of Athens was to see a myth transformed into architecture, a story frozen in stone, a reminder that fear itself was part of the foundation of the city. From here, her story would expand again into even older and wider layers of meaning. For the snakes on her head, the serpents that crowned her, carried associations that stretched far beyond Greece, linking her to symbols of death, rebirth, and transformation that had haunted human imagination for millennia. To follow Medusa further, we must turn from the temples of Athens to the serpents themselves, and to the ancient meanings they carried long before the Gorgon's face was carved into stone. If there is one feature that makes Medusa instantly recognizable, it is not the stare or the grimace, but the serpents that crown her head. They writhe, coil, and twist where human hair should flow, a living crown that never rests. In the myths, they are part of her curse, the sign of her monstrosity. In art, they are the detail that tells us immediately who she is. Yet the snakes are not simply decoration, they are the key to understanding the deeper layers of her power. For the Greeks, and for many cultures before and around them, the serpent was one of the most charged and paradoxical symbols imaginable, carrying meanings of death, rebirth, healing, and divine presence. To understand Medusa, we must understand why she wears a crown of snakes. The Greeks were hardly the first to invest snakes with sacred meaning. Across the ancient Near East, Egypt, and the wider Mediterranean, serpents appeared as divine guardians, emblems of fertility, and forces of both protection and destruction. Their behavior made them natural candidates for symbolism. They seemed to come from the earth itself, slipping in and out of holes as if they belonged to the underworld. They could kill with a single strike, their venom acting as an invisible force coursing through the body. Yet, they also shed their skins and emerged seemingly renewed, a living image of transformation and rebirth. No other creature so perfectly embodied the double-edged nature of life and death. In Mesopotamia, serpent dragons appeared as companions of the gods, protectors of temples, and symbols of cosmic power. In Egypt, the cobra, the uraeus, was worn on the crown of pharaohs, a living emblem of divine authority. The serpent goddess Wadjet was both protector and avenger, spitting fire at enemies of the king. In Canaanite and Levantine religions, serpents were linked to fertility and healing, coiling around sacred trees and thrones. By the time Greek culture emerged, the serpent was already centuries deep in associations with life, death, and the sacred. Within Greece itself, snakes played a striking role in myth and ritual. The household snake was considered a protective spirit, honored with offerings of milk and honey. Archaeological evidence shows that snake figurines were placed in domestic shrines, a sign that these creatures were thought to guard the home. In some regions, sacred snakes were kept in temples, living embodiments of divine presence. At Delphi, the great sanctuary of Apollo, the myth told of the god slaying Python, a monstrous serpent, and establishing his oracle upon its body. The serpent was both the enemy of the god and the spirit of the place itself, woven into the sacred power of the sanctuary. The healing god Asclepius was always depicted with a staff entwined by a serpent. This symbol survives today as the caduceus, a universal emblem of medicine. The snake here is not destructive, but restorative. A creature whose venom could kill, but whose association with rebirth through skin shedding made it a natural emblem of healing. Greek physicians kept live snakes in their sanctuaries, where the sick would sleep in hopes of divine dreams and cures. The snake's touch, slithering across the body of a supplicant, was thought to carry the god's power. This duality, deadly yet healing, chthonic yet divine, made the serpent a perfect symbol for the Greeks' most complex ideas. It was never simply good or evil, it was always both. And when the snake was placed on Medusa's head, those associations flowed into her myth. She became a figure of dread because snakes were dreadful, but also a figure of sacredness because snakes were sacred. The connection goes even deeper when we look at earlier Aegean traditions. On the island of Crete, long before the rise of classical Greece, the Minoans produced images of women holding snakes in their outstretched hands. These so-called snake goddesses, dating to around 1600 BCE, show bare-breasted women in elaborate skirts, poised and commanding, with serpents curling up their arms. Archaeologists still debate exactly what these figures represent, but most agree they were linked to fertility, regeneration, and divine authority. The snake here is not a mark of monstrosity, but of power. Some scholars suggest that the Greeks inherited echoes of this tradition and transformed it over time. What was once a goddess holding snakes may, in the reshaping of myth, have become a woman cursed to wear them. If this interpretation is right, then Medusa's snakes are not only marks of horror, but distant memories of ancient reverence. The monstrous crown may be a distorted survival of earlier images in which the serpent was an emblem of divine female power. In other words, the Greeks may have turned an ancient goddess into a monster, preserving her snakes but inverting their meaning. Where once they signified life and authority, they now marked her as cursed and dangerous. The ambiguity of the snake crown is also tied to Medusa's role as a liminal figure. She stands at the threshold between mortal and divine, between life and death, between beauty and monstrosity. The snakes reinforce that role. They are creatures that live between categories, neither entirely of the earth nor entirely of the air, neither wholly deadly nor wholly beneficent. They slip between worlds, just as Medusa does. They make her untouchable, because to face her is to face the unknown. Even Perseus's victory over Medusa can be seen through this lens. He does not fight her snakes directly. He does not attempt to cut them or charm them. He avoids their gaze entirely, approaching through reflection. In doing so, he acknowledges their power. The snakes are not defeated. They remain alive, writhing on the severed head, still potent even after Medusa herself is gone.
The Greeks could imagine many monsters slain outright, their power ended, but the snakes of Medusa remain immortal, continuing to terrify long after the hero's quest is over. This persistence of the snakes also explains why the Gorgonean became such a powerful apotropaic symbol. To carve a snake-haired head into stone was to capture not just horror, but sacred force. The same snakes that terrified could protect. To place Medusa's face on a temple was not to invite danger, but to harness it, turning her venom outward against intruders. The Greeks did not erase the paradox, they embraced it. Psychologically, the snakes tap into something primal.
Even modern science suggests that humans are unusually adept at recognizing serpent shapes and reacting with fear. Some researchers argue that our evolutionary ancestors developed this instinct as a survival mechanism. If so, then the Greeks were not simply inventing a symbol, but giving form to an instinct that lay deep in the human mind. To crown Medusa with snakes was to make her the embodiment of a fear older than civilization itself. And yet, precisely because snakes also carried meanings of healing and rebirth, Medusa could never be reduced to mere horror. Her gaze kills, but her blood, according to myth, can both poison and cure. The snakes on her head encapsulate this contradiction. They are venomous, but they are also transformative. They kill, but they also signify renewal.
In this way, the snake crown is not only a curse, but a clue. It tells us that Medusa is not simply a monster. She is a figure of transition, a being who embodies the sacred ambiguity of life and death. The Greeks may have cursed her, the poets may have made her a victim, and the heroes may have slain her. But in crowning her with serpents, they could not escape the deeper symbolic weight of what snakes meant. They turned her into an image that terrified and protected at once, an image that spoke of mortality and immortality, destruction and healing. The snakes are why Medusa's face could be carved on a temple and believed to guard it. They are why her image endured, even after her story was retold and reshaped. So when we see her in art, the snakes should not be read as merely monstrous. They are sacred, drawn from a long lineage of serpent symbolism that stretches back before Greece, through the Near East and Egypt, into the very heart of ancient religion. Medusa's crown is not only a punishment but a survival, a trace of the serpent as divine protector, carried forward into a new and darker age. And as her snakes connect her to these wider traditions, they also link her to her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, whose own monstrousness was less defined, but whose place in myth reminds us that Medusa was never alone. To understand the full scope of the Gorgon myth, we must turn to that trio of sisters, the three whose names echo from Hesiod onward, whose bond was eternal, and whose story reveals another layer of what it meant to be a Gorgon in the Greek imagination. When we speak of Medusa, it is easy to forget that she was never alone. From the earliest accounts, the Greeks placed her among a trio of beings known as the Gorgons. Hesiod named them in his Theogony, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, daughters of the primordial sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. In most traditions, they lived together at the edge of the world, beyond Oceanus, in the shadowy lands where night and day touch. But of the three, only Medusa is mortal. This detail, repeated again and again in the sources, is what set her apart. It gave Perseus a target, it gave poets a story, yet it also raises questions. What did the Greeks imagine when they spoke of the three Gorgons? Why was one mortal and the other two eternal? And what did their sisterhood mean in the larger scheme of the myth? The names themselves carry meaning. Stheno means strength or forceful, a name that suggests brute power, an indomitable presence. Euryale can be translated as far-roaming or wide-leaping, evoking movement, expansiveness, perhaps a cry that echoes across distance. Medusa, in contrast, comes from a root meaning guardian or to protect. Already in the names we can sense the range of qualities the Gorgons embodied: strength, vastness, guardianship. These were not arbitrary figures but personifications of primal forces condensed into monstrous form. In Hesiod's account, Stheno and Euryale are immortal, forever beyond the reach of human heroes. They are not killed, not overcome, not given stories of their own. They exist as eternal companions to Medusa, defined by their monstrousness, but never fully individuated. This imbalance, two immortal sisters and one mortal, creates the dramatic tension of the myth. It explains why Perseus could succeed in his quest, and why Medusa, and not her sisters, became the center of the story. But the presence of the sisters is more than background. They make Medusa's death more poignant. She is not just slain in isolation, she is torn from a trio, the only one of the three who could be killed, leaving Stheno and Euryale to mourn her eternally. Ancient sources describe them shrieking with grief when Perseus beheads Medusa, their cries echoing across the world. This detail emphasizes the cost of her death. Even if she is a monster to the hero, she is still part of a family, and her loss wounds those who remain. The Gorgons as a trio also fit into a broader Greek pattern of grouping uncanny beings into threes. The Graeae, sisters of the Gorgons, share one eye and one tooth between them. The Furies, or Erinyes, who punish the guilty, are often counted as three. The Moirai, or Fates, who spin the thread of life, are three. This triadic structure gave the Greeks a way of embodying forces that were larger than life. By placing them in threes, they gave them symmetry and weight, a rhythm that echoed in ritual and storytelling. To speak of the Gorgons was to invoke not just one face of terror, but a triad, a chorus of dread. Archaeological depictions often reinforce this. On early temple pediments, we sometimes see not just one Gorgon, but three, aligned or pursuing. The archaic sculptors portrayed them as nearly identical, with the same grimacing faces, tusks, and wings. Medusa is not yet distinguished from her sisters in these images. Only later, as her individual story grew, did artists focus on her alone, usually shown with Perseus in the act of slaying her. Before that, the Gorgons were a collective, a triad of monstrous guardians standing together against the world of men. The idea of Medusa as the mortal among immortals also carried symbolic weight. It positioned her as a bridge between worlds. She shared the essence of her sisters, but was subject to death, just as humans are. In her, the Greeks could imagine a figure both divine and mortal, terrifying and vulnerable. This liminality made her story possible, but also made her compelling. If she had been immortal like Stheno and Euryale, Perseus' quest would have been meaningless. If she had been mortal but alone, she would have lacked the resonance of a sisterhood. It is the tension between her mortality and their immortality that gives her myth its distinctive shape. Yet the sisters themselves are strangely elusive. The sources tell us almost nothing of their individual characters beyond their names.
Unlike Medusa, they are not given curses or backstories. They are not pursued by heroes. They exist primarily as part of the backdrop of her story, living reminders that Medusa is part of a larger whole. This elusiveness is itself telling. It suggests that the Greeks did not need or want to humanize them. Medusa could become tragic or sympathetic, but her sisters remained firmly in the realm of the monstrous. They were the eternal frame that set her apart. Some scholars have suggested that the trio of Gorgons represents older chthonic powers, remnants of pre-Olympian religion. In this view, Medusa and her sisters may descend from ancient mother goddess figures whose terrifying aspects were absorbed into Greek myth as monstrous beings. The immortality of Stheno and Euryale would then make sense. They are not meant to die because they are not meant to be overcome. They are personifications of forces that endure: death, night, terror itself. Medusa alone was made mortal, perhaps as a way for the Olympian order to assert control, to provide a story in which chaos could be contained. The cries of Stheno and Euryale after Medusa's death also resonate with the theme of grief in Greek myth. Monsters in Greek stories often die without witnesses or mourners. But Medusa is mourned. Her sisters' shrieks echo like the laments of women at a funeral, reminding us that even monsters are part of kinship networks and that their loss reverberates.
It complicates the image of Perseus as a triumphant hero. Yes, he completes his quest, but he also leaves behind grief, tearing apart a family, however monstrous. The The triple structure also reinforced Medusa's role as part of a continuum of female figures who terrified and fascinated the Greeks. Just as the fates spun and cut the threads of life, and just as the Furies pursued those who violated kinship bonds, the Gorgons represented another aspect of dread, one linked to the gaze, the face, and the threshold between life and death. Their triad was a way of giving shape to an overwhelming concept, turning dread itself into a set of sisters who could be named, pictured, and feared. In later retellings, especially in art and literature of the classical and Roman periods, Stheno and Euryale recede even further into the shadows. Medusa becomes the focus, the one whose beauty, curse, and death are elaborated. Yet the memory of the sisters never disappears. They remain part of the mythic landscape, reminders that Medusa was not alone, that she belonged to a lineage of beings who stood outside the human order. This lingering presence shaped how the Greeks and later cultures understood Medusa. She was not a solitary monster isolated in her horror. She was part of a sisterhood, bound to others who shared her form but not her fate. Her uniqueness lay in her mortality, but her meaning lay in the context of her sisters. To see Medusa is always, implicitly, to remember Stheno and Euryale, the immortal echoes of her dread. And this triad, strange and incomplete though it may seem, prepared the ground for the paradoxes that would follow. For from Medusa's blood came both poison and healing, both destruction and salvation. The sisters frame her as a monster, but her death reveals her as something more. To understand the full depth of that paradox, we must turn to what flowed from her veins, the power that could kill with a drop or restore life itself, the blood of the Gorgon. When Perseus severed the head of Medusa, the story could have ended in triumph, with a monster slain and a hero victorious. But the Greeks told a different story. From her neck, they said, flowed not only blood, but power, a liquid that embodied contradiction itself. Some accounts tell us that from the left side of her blood came a poison so deadly that even a drop could kill, while from the right side came a medicine so potent it could heal, restore, even bring the dead back to life. No other figure in Greek mythology carried such a paradox in their veins. The blood of Medusa was both the deadliest toxin and the most miraculous cure. This strange duality appears in various sources. Pindar, writing in the 5th century BCE, refers to the healing power of the Gorgon's blood, claiming that it was given to Asclepius, the god of medicine, who used it to perform his miraculous cures. Later writers elaborate on the idea, saying that Athena herself took some of the blood and delivered it to Asclepius. One vial contained the essence of death, the other the essence of life. In this way, the Gorgon's blood passed into the hands of the healer, ensuring that her power, even after death, continued to shape human fate. The symbolism here is striking. Medusa, cursed and slain, becomes the source of medicine. The monster whose gaze petrified and whose face terrified now provides the very substance that heals. But the Greeks were careful not to simplify the paradox. Her blood remained ambivalent. From one side came the poison, from the other the cure. The two could never be separated completely, and the line between healing and harm remained razor thin. This reflects a truth that the Greeks recognized well. The boundary between medicine and poison is not fixed. The same substance that can kill in one dose can cure in another. Snake venom, deadly in the wild, could also be used in controlled ways for healing. By linking Medusa's blood to both poison and remedy, the Greeks were acknowledging the double nature of power itself. It is worth noting that snakes themselves, the creatures that crowned her head, embodied the same duality. Their bite could kill, but their shedding of skin symbolized renewal and rebirth. The healing cult of Asclepius, which kept live snakes in its temples, shows how strongly this paradox shaped Greek thought. Snakes slithered through both myth and ritual as symbols of death and recovery. Medusa's blood simply magnified this duality, making it literal. Her veins carried the logic of the snake crown to its ultimate conclusion. The story of Asclepius receiving Medusa's blood also reflects a broader pattern in Greek mythology, the passing of power from chthonic, dangerous sources into the hands of more orderly Olympian figures.
Just as Perseus transfers the head of Medusa to Athena, ensuring that her dreadful face becomes a weapon of divine justice, so too is her blood passed to Asclepius, transforming raw, terrifying power into controlled healing. The myth enacts a kind of domestication of dread. The wild, monstrous force of the Gorgon is not erased, but absorbed into the structures of Greek religion, where it becomes part of civic life. The same blood that could annihilate is now the essence of medicine, used in sanctuaries to restore health. At the same time, the paradox of the blood preserved Medusa's ambiguity. She could not be reduced to victim or monster, destroyer or healer. Her veins carried both. To spill her blood was to release into the world a power that no single category could contain. It is this refusal to resolve into a single meaning that makes her myth so enduring. Medusa is always both, and never only one thing. The Greeks were fascinated by such paradoxes, especially when it came to death and life. In the cult of Asclepius, healing often came through dreams in which the god appeared, sometimes accompanied by snakes, offering remedies or instructions. Patients would sleep in the temple, hoping for divine visions that would cure their illnesses. To link this god to the blood of Medusa was to say that true healing comes from confronting the terror of death itself. Medicine was not simply about avoiding death, but about engaging with it, transforming its power into something restorative. Medusa's blood captured that truth perfectly. In some versions, her blood was also connected to resurrection. Asclepius, armed with the life-giving vial, was said to raise the dead. But this power was too much, a threat to the order of the cosmos. Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt, ending his defiance of mortality. Here again, Medusa's legacy is double-edged. Her blood gave life, but it also disrupted the balance of life and death. To possess it was both a blessing and a curse. There are also stories in which her blood produced creatures of its own. Pegasus and Chrysaea, born from her neck at the moment of her death, are the most famous, but other myths suggest that drops of her blood, spilled on the Libyan sands, gave rise to venomous serpents that spread across the desert. In this telling, the land itself was marked by her passing, seeded with new dangers. Her blood became not only medicine, but an origin of death-dealing creatures. Once again, she gives both life and death, never one without the other. The symbolism of blood itself deepens the resonance. For the Greeks, blood was life. To spill it was to release vitality, to end a life. But in ritual, blood also carried sacred meaning. Animal sacrifices spilled blood onto altars, binding humans and gods. Heroes and gods alike swore oaths by blood. To imagine Medusa's blood as uniquely potent was to imagine her life force as extraordinary, too powerful to vanish with her body. Her blood did not simply soak into the earth, it remained active, shaping the world in contradictory ways. The link between her blood and medicine also connects to the wider theme of the monstrous as a source of wisdom. Time and again in Greek myth, dangerous, terrifying figures possess knowledge or power that mortals need. The prophet Tiresias is blinded but granted the gift of prophecy. The titan Prometheus is punished eternally for giving fire to humanity. Medusa, slain by a hero, becomes the source of medicine. In each case, suffering and monstrosity are intertwined with gifts that shape human destiny. Power is never pure. It always carries danger with it. This is why Medusa's blood remains such a compelling detail. It was not a footnote, but a symbol of the entire logic of her myth. She was a figure who embodied contradiction, and her veins carried that contradiction into the world. Her head petrified, Her blood killed and cured. Her death birthed new life. The Greeks did not try to erase these paradoxes. They wove them into the fabric of the myth, making Medusa one of the most complex figures in their pantheon of monsters. Later ages would seize on this symbolism in new ways. Philosophers and poets found in her blood a metaphor for the dangers and promises of knowledge.
To seek too much, like Asclepius raising the dead, was to risk destruction. To use it wisely was to heal. Renaissance thinkers, fascinated by alchemy, saw in Medusa's blood an image of transformation, of the thin line between poison and medicine, death and life. Even in modern times, the association lingers. The medical symbol of the serpent still echoes with the logic of the Gorgon's blood, a reminder that healing and danger often flow from the same source. What emerges most clearly is that Medusa was never only about destruction. From her death came horses, warriors, serpents, cures, and poisons. She was a fountain of contradictions, her story spilling into every corner of Greek imagination. And at the heart of this was her blood, a reminder that even the most terrifying beings can give life, and that even the most blessed gifts can kill. The Greeks never solved the riddle of the Gorgon's veins. They did not need to. For them, myth was not about resolution, but about reflection. Medusa's blood was a mirror of the human condition itself, fragile, mortal, poised always between sickness and health, death and survival. To imagine her veins as carrying both poison and cure was to imagine the human condition in concentrated form. And as her blood continued to flow through the myths, it also tied her more deeply to Athena, the goddess who cursed her and later carried her head. Athena, the rational goddess of wisdom, now bore on her breastplate the head of a being whose blood carried both death and life. The tension between them was not erased but embraced. Medusa became part of Athena's identity and her blood part of Asclepius's art. She was slain, but she lived on, through the powers she unleashed. And as we follow these powers outward, we see them intertwine with another thread of the myth, Medusa's complex relationship with Athena herself, the goddess who punished her, bore her head, and in some tellings, carried her blood. To understand the next stage of Medusa's story, we must turn to this fraught relationship, the tension between two female figures of Greek myth, one divine, one cursed, forever bound together in power, rivalry, and contradiction. From the moment Ovid told the story of Medusa's transformation, one figure stood at the center of her tragedy, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war, and the patron deity of Athens. The link between the two women is one of the most puzzling and provocative relationships in Greek mythology. Athena is the goddess who cursed Medusa, transforming her from a maiden into a monster. She is also the goddess who armed Perseus, guiding him to slay her. And in the end, she is the goddess who takes the severed head and places it upon her shield, making Medusa's image her own. At every stage, Athena defines Medusa's fate, yet their connection is not simple domination. It is rivalry, mirroring, and absorption, a contest between two powers that reflect and distort each other. To understand why Athena plays such a central role, we must first recall who she was in the Greek imagination. Born fully armed from the head of Zeus, she is the goddess of strategy and wisdom, the protector of cities, and the embodiment of rational, ordered power. She is also a virgin goddess, a figure who refuses marriage, sexuality, and the bonds of family. She belongs wholly to the sphere of the polis, the civic order, standing apart from the domestic and erotic worlds that defined most female figures in Greek culture. In this sense, Athena is the idealized vision of control, disciplined, armored, untouchable. Medusa, by contrast, embodies everything Athena rejects. In Ovid's version, she is a woman marked by beauty and desire, whose sexuality draws the attention of Poseidon and ultimately leads to her curse. Where Athena represents virginity and control,
Medusa becomes a symbol of violated sexuality, punished and distorted into monstrosity. The two women are opposites, one untouched, the other touched against her will, one armored, the other exposed, one rational, the other chaotic. Yet these opposites are bound together inextricably. Without Athena, Medusa's curse would not exist. Without Medusa, Athena would not carry the most terrifying emblem of divine power on her aegis. The temple setting of Medusa's violation intensifies this relationship. Poseidon's assault occurs not in the wilderness or in a mortal home, but in Athena's sacred temple. The goddess's own space is desecrated, her authority violated. In response, she directs her anger not at the god, who, as an Olympian, stands as her equal and cannot easily be punished, but at Medusa, the mortal or semi-divine woman who became the site of the transgression. In this way, Athena reasserts her authority, transforming Medusa into a permanent reminder of her power. Medusa becomes a living emblem of punishment, a warning etched into flesh. This act reflects a harsh truth about Greek mythology. Justice is often about preserving divine authority, not fairness. The victim becomes the symbol of the crime.
Medusa's transformation can be seen as a political act by Athena, ensuring that her temple remains feared and respected, but it also reveals the shadow side of Athena's role as protector of the polis. She defends the order of the city, but in doing so, she punishes those who fall outside it. Medusa, caught between the desires of a god and the authority of a goddess, becomes the scapegoat through which divine power is reinforced. Yet even in this punitive relationship, Athena and Medusa become intertwined. When Perseus seeks to slay Medusa, it is Athena who guides him. She lends him the polished shield, teaches him how to use reflection to avoid the deadly gaze, and oversees his success. The slaying of Medusa is, in a sense, Athena's victory as much as Perseus. She orchestrates the defeat of the monster she herself created, and when the head is severed, it is Athena who claims it, placing it upon her aegis where it will remain forever. In this way, the goddess absorbs the very power she cursed into being. This absorption is one of the most fascinating aspects of their relationship. Athena does not simply destroy Medusa. She takes her power, her face, her image, and makes it part of herself. From then on, to see Athena is to see Medusa. The goddess of rational wisdom carries the visage of chaotic terror. The virgin goddess bears upon her chest the face of violated femininity. The protector of the city wears the head of the monster who lived at the edges of the world.
Athena defines herself through Medusa, even as she dominates her. Some scholars have suggested that this relationship hints at older layers of myth. Athena may have inherited aspects of pre-Greek goddesses of war and protection who themselves carried serpentine or monstrous features. By cursing Medusa and then adopting her image, Athena could be seen as assimilating rival traditions, absorbing older goddess figures into her Olympian identity. In this reading, Medusa is a memory of an earlier feminine power, one that Athena, as the representative of the Olympian order, subdues and reuses. The rivalry becomes a mythic record of religious transformation, in which older deities are not erased but demonized and repurposed. Psychologically, their relationship also reflects the tensions in Greek views of women. Athena is the acceptable form of female power, rational, controlled, aligned with male authority. Medusa is the unacceptable form, sexual, violated, dangerous, uncontrollable. The two stand as mirror images, defining each other. Without Medusa, Athena would lack her most terrifying symbol. Without Athena, Medusa would lack the curse that made her infamous. Together, they embody the extremes of female identity in Greek thought, one celebrated, the other demonized. Yet the paradox goes deeper still. By wearing Medusa's head on her aegis, Athena does not simply display her triumph, She also acknowledges that her power depends on Medusa's power.
The Gorgon's face terrifies not because Athena is wise, but because Medusa's gaze petrifies. The goddess of reason relies on the force of dread, the very dread she imposed. In this way, Medusa haunts Athena, inseparable from her image. The rivalry is never resolved because the two powers cannot be disentangled. This tension is visible in art. On countless vases, statues, and coins, Athena is shown with the Gorgonean blazing from her shield or breastplate. Sometimes it is grotesque, with bulging eyes and tusks. Sometimes it is beautiful, with snakes woven into flowing hair. In either form, it is unmistakably Medusa. Athena carries her rival, her victim, and her mirror on her body at all times. The goddess is never depicted without the monster she cursed. In a sense, then, Athena did not defeat Medusa, she incorporated her. The monster became part of the goddess, and the goddess became inseparable from the monster. This is why their relationship is best described not as enmity, but as rivalry, a rivalry that defines both. Athena represents order, Medusa chaos. Athena represents virginity, Medusa violated sexuality. Athena represents the polis, Medusa the wilderness. But neither can exist in myth without the other. Later traditions would exploit this paradox. Philosophers saw in the Gorgoneon a symbol of wisdom armed with terror. Renaissance thinkers painted Athena with Medusa's head as a sign of the triumph of reason over fear.
Modern interpreters, especially feminist writers, see in their relationship the stark image of patriarchal culture punishing women for their sexuality, with Athena as an agent of that system. Yet even these interpretations cannot escape the paradox that Athena depends on Medusa, just as Medusa's fate is sealed by Athena. Their stories are intertwined forever. The rivalry also highlights the larger theme of Greek myth, that power is never simple, never pure. Even the goddess of wisdom relies on dread. Even the monster of chaos provides protection when her face is mounted on a shield. Athena and Medusa show us that opposites are not separate, but bound together, each defining and empowering the other. This is why Medusa's face remained carved into temples and worn on shields for centuries. It was not only a symbol of the monster slain by Perseus, it was a symbol of Athena's power, and through her, the power of the city. To be an Athenian was to live under the gaze of the Gorgon, to accept that wisdom and terror walked hand in hand. The rivalry between Athena and Medusa was not an ancient curiosity. It was the foundation of civic religion. And as the myth deepened, the Greeks also began to see what lay beneath this rivalry, the fear of the feminine itself. Medusa became not just a cursed maiden or a rival of Athena, but a weapon used by the patriarchal order to terrify and control. The face of the Gorgon was a reminder of what happened when female power escaped male boundaries.
To see her was to see the fear of the feminine turned into stone.
By the time Medusa's myth had settled into the form most of us know, she had become more than a monster in a story. She had become a symbol, a weapon, a mask that reflected back the deepest anxieties of the culture that created her. To the Greeks, and later to the Romans, Medusa was not just the head carried by Perseus or the emblem on Athena's aegis. She was the embodiment of dread itself, and the dread she embodied was not only about death or chaos, it was about the feminine. The Greeks, like many ancient societies, were uneasy about women's power, particularly power that could not be neatly contained within the structures of family, marriage, and the polis. Women who remained unmarried, who spoke too freely, who moved outside the boundaries of domestic life were viewed with suspicion. The myths of Greece reflect this anxiety again and again. The Amazons, a society of warrior women, are defeated by heroes. Clytemnestra, who takes power in her husband's absence, becomes the archetype of female treachery. Pandora, the first woman, is blamed for releasing all the evils into the world. These stories are not subtle. They teach that female independence is dangerous, that women must be controlled, and that when they are not, disaster follows. Medusa fits into this pattern perfectly, but with a particular intensity. She is not merely independent, she is untouchable. No man can look at her and live. Her body itself, crowned with snakes, is a weapon. She is sexuality transformed into monstrosity, desire turned lethal. In her, the Greeks crystallized their fear of female power, especially sexual power, into an image so dreadful it could petrify. Freud, centuries later, would call this the Medusa complex, reading the myth as a projection of male castration anxiety. The snakes on her head, in this interpretation, symbolize the terror of female sexuality, of the ungovernable force that threatens male identity. Whether or not one accepts Freud's language, the point is clear enough. The Greeks turned their fear of women's power into a monster, and then handed that monster to a hero to slay. Yet it was not enough to kill Medusa. Her head had to remain still potent, still deadly, but now under control. Perseus carried it as a weapon, and then Athena claimed it as her emblem. In both cases, the monstrous feminine was not erased, but subordinated, harnessed to the service of patriarchal order. The horror of female power was preserved, but in a way that made it useful to men and to male-aligned gods. The role of Athena here is crucial. As a virgin goddess aligned with Zeus and the male order of Olympus, she was an exception to the rule of female containment. Her power was acceptable because it was desexualized, disciplined, bound to the city and the father. By carrying Medusa's head, she absorbed the symbol of dangerous femininity into her own armor, neutralizing it, rebranding it, and turning it into a patriarchal weapon. What was once the dread of uncontrolled female sexuality became the sanctioned terror of the state. The placement of the Gorgoneon in Greek life reinforces this. It was painted on shields carried by male warriors into battle, carved into the stones of temples built by male civic authorities, stamped onto coins minted by male governments. The face of Medusa, once imagined as a free-floating terror, became property, controlled and directed by men. The power of the feminine, made monstrous, was thus turned into a tool of patriarchal culture, protecting the very structures that excluded women from power. This transformation did not erase the underlying fear. If anything, it made it more visible. The fact that Medusa's head continued to be displayed everywhere in Greek society suggests that the dread she embodied was not easily suppressed. The Greeks needed her image constantly, on shields, on doorways, on temples, to ward off evil. She was too powerful to discard, but too dangerous to leave uncontrolled. The solution was to keep her face, but to separate it from her body, her voice, her story. The severed head, silent and weaponized, was the form in which Medusa survived. In this form, she was safe for patriarchal culture. She was no longer a woman with agency or desire. She was an object, a tool, a mask to be displayed. The horror of her sexuality was neutralized by decapitation, her voice silenced forever. All that remained was the image of fear, wielded by men and by Athena, the most male-aligned of goddesses. And yet, even in this controlled form, Medusa retained a trace of rebellion. Her face, staring out from shields and temples, still carried the memory of what she had been. The Greeks could never entirely erase the fact that she was once a woman, cursed and transformed. The snakes on her head, the eyes that petrified, remained reminders of the anxieties that had created her. The patriarchal weapon always carried within it the fear of the feminine that gave it birth. This is why Medusa has remained such a potent figure for later ages. In her, we can see the dynamics of patriarchal culture at work: fear of female power, punishment of female sexuality, appropriation of female symbols for male use. But we can also see the cracks in that structure, the way the monster never entirely fits the role assigned to her. Medusa's power cannot be erased, only redirected. Even as a patriarchal weapon, she remains a threat. In art, this tension is palpable. Classical statues of Athena show her serene and composed, but on her chest blazes the face of Medusa, wild-eyed and ferocious. The juxtaposition tells the story: rational order cannot stand alone. It must display the terror it controls. The patriarchal order needs the monstrous feminine as its shadow, its emblem, its warning. In this way, Medusa is both suppressed and indispensable. The Romans inherited this logic and carried it forward. They placed the Gorgonean on military standards, public buildings, and jewelry. The face of Medusa became a symbol of imperial power, a talisman against chaos, a mark of Rome's dominance. Yet behind this display was the same anxiety, the fear of what the feminine represented, the need to display it in order to control it. Modern interpreters, especially feminist thinkers, have seized on this dynamic. To them, Medusa is not simply a monster, but an image of how patriarchy constructs women as monstrous in order to control them. Her story is not about a beast defeated by a hero, but about a woman punished for her sexuality, silenced, decapitated, and turned into a weapon for the very system that oppressed her. The fact that she remains powerful even in this form is part of her allure. She resists total erasure, her gaze still threatening even when torn from her body. The Greeks may have used Medusa as a patriarchal weapon, but they could never fully contain her. Her image continued to haunt them, to demand display, to terrify and fascinate. In their attempt to neutralize the feminine, they created a figure that ensured the feminine would never disappear. Medusa remained, her face blazing from the heart of their culture, a reminder of the power they feared most. And this paradox would only deepen as her myth spread beyond Greece. For in other cultures, the serpent-haired woman has echoes, sisters, and counterparts, figures who embody similar fears and fascinations. The Greeks were not alone in turning female power into monstrous form. To understand Medusa fully, we must look outward to the serpent mothers and snake goddesses of the wider ancient world and see how her face resonates with theirs. The story of Medusa is often told as though she emerged fully formed from the imagination of the Greeks, a monster born of divine genealogy, cursed by Athena and slain by Perseus. But when we look more closely at her imagery, her symbols, and her role in myth, a different picture begins to appear. Medusa may not have begun as a monster at all. She may once have been something far older, something sacred. The serpent crown, the apotropaic face, the power to protect as well as destroy, all these elements suggest that the Gorgon is not an invention, but a transformation. What began as a figure of reverence may have been demonized over time, reshaped into the monstrous form we know today. The clues are scattered across the ancient world. In Minoan Crete, centuries before Homer, we find statues of the so-called snake goddesses, bare-breasted women in elaborate skirts, holding serpents in their outstretched hands. These figures, dating to around 1600 BCE, were almost certainly divine or priestly. The snakes they hold are not marks of horror, but of power, fertility, and protection. They connect these women to the earth, to regeneration, to the sacred cycle of life and death. When we look at Medusa's snake crown, the resemblance is hard to ignore. The feature that defines her monstrosity in Greek myth may once have marked divinity in older cultures. The apotropaic function of the Gorgon's face adds weight to this idea. From the earliest Greek temples, the Gorgonean was carved into pediments and doorways as a guardian symbol. Its wide eyes, protruding tongue, and terrifying stare were meant to repel evil, not embody it. The very same face that Perseus was said to use as a weapon was also believed to protect homes and sanctuaries. This dual role makes little sense if the Gorgon was always a monster. But if she began as a protective spirit, a sacred guardian whose visage warded off danger,
Then her later demonization into a monster slain by a hero looks more like a cultural shift than an original state. This kind of transformation was not unusual in Greek myth. Many figures who seem monstrous or threatening in later stories may have begun as deities or spirits of older traditions. The Furies, who hound the guilty, bear traces of older goddesses of justice. Hecate, associated with witchcraft and ghosts in later thought, was once a revered goddess of crossroads and liminal spaces. Even Athena herself may have inherited aspects of pre-Greek goddesses, absorbing their powers into her Olympian identity. It is entirely possible that Medusa followed a similar path. Once a revered serpent goddess or protective figure, reimagined as a horror once the Olympian order reshaped myth. Why would such a transformation happen? Part of the answer lies in the shift from matriarchal to patriarchal structures in the ancient Mediterranean.
In earlier agricultural societies, fertility goddesses and mother figures often occupied central places in religion. They embodied the cycles of nature, the power of the earth, the mystery of birth and death. But as patriarchal systems consolidated power, especially in the city-states of Greece, these older goddesses were often diminished, reinterpreted, or demonized. Their terrifying aspects were exaggerated, their nurturing roles minimized, and their independence recast as danger. Medusa fits this pattern well. She carries the signs of ancient feminine power, the snake, the protective face, the connection to life and death. Yet in Greek myth, she becomes a monster to be slain, her power harnessed by male heroes and gods. The involvement of Athena in Medusa's curse makes this process even clearer. Athena herself may have absorbed elements of older snake goddesses, as suggested by her frequent association with serpents in art and myth. In some depictions, a snake coils beside her or beneath her shield. Her adoption of the Gorgon may represent more than just victory. It may symbolize the assimilation of Medusa's older divine power into Athena's Olympian identity. The monster's face becomes the goddess's emblem. What was once independent divinity is subordinated to the new order of Zeus and his children. This process of turning protectors into monsters is not unique to Greece. In Mesopotamian myth, Lilitu or Lilith, who may once have been a protective goddess or spirit, was later demonized into a child-killing demon. In the Levant, Astarte and Anat, powerful war and fertility goddesses, were reinterpreted by later cultures as dangerous or excessive. Even in Christian tradition, older pagan deities were recast as demons, their sacred animals transformed into signs of evil. Medusa's transformation is part of this wider pattern, in which divine feminine figures are reimagined as threats once patriarchal systems seek to assert dominance. The traces of her older role never disappeared entirely. The continued use of the Gorgonaion as a protective symbol suggests that ordinary Greeks still experienced her image as beneficial. To carve her face above a doorway or wear it on a shield was not to invoke horror for its own sake. It was to call upon her protective force, even if her myth cast her as a monster. This tension between Medusa the destroyer in myth and Medusa the protector in practice reveals the depth of her ambiguity. She could not be reduced to one role because her roots stretched deeper than the myths that sought to define her. Even the story of her blood, with its dual power to kill and to heal, fits this pattern. It reflects the memory of a goddess whose essence encompassed both life and death, fertility and danger. By the time the Greeks told the story, this power was fragmented, divided into poison and cure, horror and blessing. But the underlying logic remains the same. Medusa is not simply a monster. She is a figure who embodies the full spectrum of sacred power. The demonization of Medusa also served a political function. By casting her as a monster slain by Perseus, Greek myth reinforced the triumph of the hero, the man aligned with the gods of Olympus, over older, wilder forces. The story taught that chaos and dread could be subdued, that the monstrous feminine could be conquered and repurposed. It was a myth that reassured the patriarchal order, but one that also betrayed its anxieties, for the need to retell the story, to carve her face everywhere, to place her head on Athena's shield, shows that the fear of her power never went away. She was too deeply rooted in cultural memory, too bound to ancient reverence, to vanish. The result is a myth that preserves traces of both layers at once. Medusa is both monster and protector, both cursed woman and ancient goddess. She is terrifying because she is powerful, and she is powerful because she carries the memory of divinity. Her demonization did not erase her sacred origins. It only obscured them, leaving behind fragments for later ages to piece together. This is why Medusa continues to fascinate. She is not just a story of a hero's victory, but a record of cultural transformation, of the way divine feminine power was reshaped into monstrous form.
To see her face is to glimpse the layers of history, the ancient snake goddess of Crete, the apotropaic protector of temples, the cursed victim of Athena, the head on Perseus's shield. Each layer contradicts and reinforces the others. She is all of them at once and none of them entirely. And as her image spread beyond Greece, echoes of this older divine role became clearer. For in other cultures we find serpent mothers, snake goddesses, and guardian figures who share her features. To understand Medusa fully, we must place her in this wider context, tracing the parallels and resonances that show she was never only a Greek monster, but part of a much older and broader human imagination.
Medusa may be the most famous serpent woman of the Western tradition, but she is far from unique. Across the ancient world, cultures told stories of women crowned with snakes, mothers of serpents, or guardians whose bodies merged with serpentine forms. These figures did not always appear as monsters. Often they were revered as goddesses, embodiments of fertility, death, and the mysteries of transformation. When we place Medusa in this broader company, her story takes on new dimensions. She ceases to be an isolated Greek invention and becomes part of a vast human pattern, one that reaches from Mesopotamia to India, from Egypt to Mesoamerica. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest figures linked to serpents was Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, she is described as birthing the first generation of gods, but when they rebel, she takes the form of a monstrous serpent dragon, leading an army of chaos creatures against them. Marduk, the storm god, defeats her and splits her body to form the heavens and the earth. Here again we see the pattern, a serpent mother associated with creation and chaos, demonized into a monster to be slain by a male hero. Tiamat's fate foreshadows Medusa's. Both begin as figures of fertility and power, only to be reinterpreted as enemies of order, conquered and subordinated by patriarchal gods. Closer to Greece, in the Levant and Anatolia, serpent goddesses appear in various guises. The Canaanite goddess Anat, though often depicted as a warrior, has ties to serpents and to the regenerative powers of blood. In Ugaritic texts, she slays and revives the god Baal, embodying the cycle of death and renewal. The Phoenician Astarte and her sisters were sometimes shown with serpent companions, their power linked to fertility and protection. These goddesses share with Medusa the paradox of life and death intertwined, their serpentine features marking them as liminal figures who could both nurture and destroy. In Egypt, the serpent was one of the most sacred symbols in the divine pantheon. The cobra goddess Wadjet was the protector of Lower Egypt and the emblem of kingship. The uraeus, a rearing cobra, adorned the crowns of pharaohs, spitting fire at enemies. To wear the serpent on one's brow was to claim divine authority. Other serpent deities, like Meretsiga, the cobra goddess who guarded the Valley of the Kings, embodied both punishment and mercy. Those who desecrated tombs were struck down by her venom, while the pious received her protection. The parallel with Medusa is striking, a female figure marked by serpents, simultaneously protector and punisher, whose gaze, or in this case strike, could bring death. In India, the Naga tradition offers yet another perspective. Nagas are serpent beings, sometimes male, sometimes female, often dwelling in rivers, lakes, and subterranean realms. They are guardians of treasures and knowledge, feared for their deadly bite, but revered for their protective power. Female Naginis in particular were depicted as half woman, half snake, embodying fertility and abundance. Temples dedicated to them show them as divine beings to be worshipped, rather than monsters to be slain. The Nagas capture perfectly the ambiguity of serpent figures, liminal, powerful, linked to both danger and blessing. Even in Mesoamerica, far from the Mediterranean, we find echoes of the serpent mother. The Aztec goddess Coatlicue, whose name means she of the serpent's skirt, was the mother of gods and humans alike. She wore a skirt of snakes and a necklace of severed hands and hearts. Her appearance was terrifying, yet she was a creator goddess, giving birth to life even as she embodied death. Her story, like Medusa's, shows how serpentine imagery fuses fertility with dread, motherhood with monstrosity. What unites all these figures, Tiamat, Wadjet, the Naginis, Coatlicue, and Medusa, is the same symbolic core. The serpent is never a simple creature in human imagination. It always carries paradox. It kills and it heals. It crawls in the earth but seems immortal, renewing itself through the shedding of skin. It emerges from holes like a being of the underworld, but also coils around trees, fountains and temples, guarding sacred spaces. To crown a woman with serpents, or to merge her body with serpentine form, is to make her the embodiment of these mysteries, a figure who bridges life and death, earth and underworld, terror and reverence. The Greeks, inheriting this ancient symbolism, seem to have inverted it. Where Egypt placed the cobra on the brow of kings, Greece placed the snake on the head of a monster. Where India revered Naginis as guardians of water and fertility, Greece cursed Medusa with serpents for hair as punishment. Where Crete once raised figurines of snake-bearing goddesses in shrines, classical Greek temples carved Gorgon heads as apotropaic masks of horror. The pattern is clear. What other cultures treated as divine, the Greeks treated as monstrous. The protective snake goddess became the monstrous snake-haired Gorgon. This process reflects the cultural shift from older goddess-centered religions to the patriarchal Olympian order. The Olympian pantheon, dominated by Zeus and his brothers, often reinterpreted older female powers as threats. The Furies became agents of vengeance rather than goddesses of justice. Hecate was relegated to witchcraft and crossroads. And Medusa, whose snake crown likely echoed ancient divinity, was recast as a horror slain by Perseus, her power absorbed into Athena's aegis. The demonization of serpent mothers was part of a broader rewriting of divine power, turning goddesses into monsters to reaffirm the authority of the new order. Yet the older echoes never disappeared entirely. The apotropaic function of the Gorgonean shows that the Greeks still experienced Medusa's image as protective, even if their myths called her a monster. Her face on shields and temples worked in the same way as Wadjet's cobra or the Nagini guardians of India. She was still invoked as a protector, even if the stories painted her as cursed. The tension between myth and practice preserves the memory of her divine roots. When we place Medusa alongside these other serpent mothers, her paradox becomes clearer. She is both like them and unlike them. Like them, she embodies the fusion of death and life, dread and fertility. Unlike them, she is condemned, slain, and silenced, her power taken from her. This contrast reveals more about Greek culture than about Medusa herself. Where other societies could live with the ambiguity of the serpent goddess, Greece could not. It had to tame her, demonize her and harness her power through heroes and Olympians. And yet, even in demonization, she remained. Her face stared down from temple pediments, glared from coins, guarded homes, and rode into battle on shields. The Greeks could not erase her protective power, only rename it. She was not goddess but monster, not protector, but horror. Yet in practice, she still protected, still guarded, still mediated between mortal and divine. The serpent mother survived even if her name had changed. Name had. This survival explains why Medusa has endured across millennia. She is not simply a Greek monster. She is part of a global archetype, the serpent woman who embodies transformation, death, and life. Her story echoes Tiamat's, Wadjet's, Coatlique's, the Naginis. Each culture tells it differently, but the core remains the same. The feminine crowned with serpents is too powerful to ignore. She must be revered, feared, controlled, or slain, but she can never be erased. And as her story traveled forward into later centuries, this archetype continued to haunt imagination. In Rome, her face became imperial. In the Middle Ages, she became a demonic emblem. In the Renaissance, she was reimagined in art and poetry. Each retelling added new layers, but the ancient echoes remained beneath them. To look at Medusa was always to look at something older than Greece, older than myth itself, the serpent mother, staring back across the ages. When the poets of archaic Greece first sang of Medusa, they likely did not imagine she would one day become a figure studied not only by historians and artists, but by psychologists and philosophers. Yet no other monster of classical myth has been so persistently interpreted as a symbol of the human mind itself. From Freud's essays to Jung's archetypes, from modern psychoanalysis to theories of the uncanny, Medusa has been treated not merely as a mythological being, but as a mirror, one that reflects back the deepest fears, desires, and contradictions of the psyche. The first and most famous psychological reading comes from Sigmund Freud. In a short essay entitled Medusa's Head, he argued that the Gorgon represented castration anxiety, the primal male fear of losing power, embodied in the terror of female sexuality. The snakes that writhe on her head, Freud suggested, were phallic symbols, multiplying in excess and thus intensifying the dread. To look at her was to be petrified, frozen in the paralysis of fear, a reaction Freud linked to the shock of encountering female genitals from a male perspective. In this reading, Perseus's act of decapitation becomes the symbolic overcoming of that fear, while Athena's wearing of the Gorgonean represents the taming of feminine terror by patriarchal order. Freud's interpretation is deeply rooted in his time, shaped by his focus on male psychosexual development, but it remains influential because it highlights something essential. Medusa embodies the fear of looking. Her power is in the gaze, and the gaze is central to how humans relate to each other. To be turned to stone is to lose movement, speech, and agency, to be reduced to an object under the eyes of another. In this sense, Medusa captures a universal anxiety, the terror of being seen in a way that strips us of power. Carl Jung approached the myth differently. For him, Medusa was not just a symbol of male anxiety, but an archetype of the shadow, the dark, repressed aspects of the psyche that we fear but must confront. Her monstrous features, terrifying but strangely compelling, represent the parts of ourselves we try to deny. Perseus's use of the mirror to defeat her is, in Jung's view, symbolic of reflection, the act of facing one's inner shadow indirectly, acknowledging its presence without being destroyed by it. The head of Medusa, carried by Athena afterward, becomes the emblem of integrating this shadow into consciousness, harnessing its power rather than denying it. Both Freud and Jung recognized that Medusa's story was not just about mythology, but about the psychology of fear. What makes her unique among monsters is that her weapon is not claws or fire, but vision itself. She kills by being looked at or by looking. This inversion of normal power, where the act of seeing becomes fatal, disturbs our ordinary experience of the world. It is here that modern psychology links her to the concept of the uncanny. The uncanny, as Freud defined it in another essay, is the feeling of something being both familiar and strange at the same time. It is the eerie discomfort of recognizing something we know, but in a distorted, unsettling form. Medusa embodies this perfectly. She is human and inhuman, beautiful and grotesque, woman and monster. The snakes on her head replace what should be familiar hair with something alien and threatening. Her face is recognizable, but her gaze is lethal. She is both too close and too distant, both knowable and impossible to comprehend. To look at her is to encounter the uncanny in its purest form. The uncanny also explains why Medusa continues to haunt art and literature. She is not simply terrifying, she is disturbingly fascinating. Viewers cannot look away, even though to look is to risk petrification. This dynamic mirrors psychological fascination with trauma and repression. The things we fear most are the things we cannot stop returning to in thought. Medusa is a mythic embodiment of that cycle. She is the trauma we revisit, the image we cannot unsee, the mirror of the mind that both horrifies and compels. The petrifying gaze also resonates with the psychology of shame. To be looked at with judgment, to feel exposed, is often described as freezing up. Medusa's victims literally freeze, turned into stone under her gaze. In this sense, she symbolizes the power of the social eye, the way humans can be immobilized by the perception of others. The terror of her stare reflects a very human experience, the fear of being seen too deeply, of being exposed in our vulnerability. Modern psychoanalysis has also emphasized the link between Medusa and repressed anger, particularly female anger. For centuries, cultures have feared the power of women's rage, often depicting it as unnatural, dangerous, or monstrous. Medusa, cursed and silenced, embodies that rage. Her petrifying gaze can be read as the fury of a woman punished by injustice, turned outward against the world. To see her is to confront not just fear, but suppressed fury, the fury of those denied voice, agency, or justice. Feminist psychology has taken this even further, reclaiming Medusa as a symbol of empowerment. Writers such as Hélène Cixous have argued that the horror of Medusa is a male projection, a way of demonizing female sexuality. You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her, Cixous wrote, and she's not deadly, she's beautiful, and she's laughing. In this view, the myth reveals less about women than about male fear of women, and reclaiming Medusa means rejecting the patriarchal gaze that turned her into a monster. Beyond psychoanalysis, Medusa has also been used in discussions of aesthetics and art. Her face, frozen in horror, is a paradoxical image, terrifying but beautiful, grotesque but symmetrical. Philosophers have noted that this tension mirrors the way art itself often presents us with controlled depictions of horror, allowing us to confront fear safely. Medusa's head, mounted on Athena's shield, becomes a metaphor for art itself. Dread turned into an image, fear made bearable through representation. The uncanny dimension of Medusa also links to dreams and nightmares. She often appears in modern accounts as a dream symbol, an image of overwhelming dread that nonetheless carries meaning. To dream of being turned to stone, psychologists note, often signifies a feeling of paralysis in life, of being trapped by fear or judgment. Medusa, then, continues to function as a psychological symbol, surfacing in the unconscious as an embodiment of inner struggles. The mirror, too, remains central. Perseus's victory depends on using reflection to avoid direct sight. This has been read psychologically as the necessity of mediation when confronting inner terror. To face our fears directly may be overwhelming, but through reflection, Whether in art, therapy, or self-examination, we can approach them indirectly, acknowledging them without destruction. Medusa, in this sense, becomes the archetype of what must be faced but cannot be faced head-on.
The enduring psychological power of her story lies in its refusal to resolve. Medusa is always contradictory, victim and monster, protector and destroyer, beautiful and grotesque, terrifying and fascinating. These contradictions mirror the contradictions of the human psyche itself. We are never simply one thing. We are layered, ambivalent, torn between fear and desire, repression and expression. Medusa is not outside us, she is inside, the face we glimpse in our own reflections when fear or rage rises too sharply to be contained. In this way, the myth becomes not just a story of gods and heroes, but a parable of the mind. Perseus' mirror is our reflection. The petrifying gaze is our shame, our trauma, our repression. Athena's aegis is our attempt to control and contain what frightens us, and Medusa herself is the shadow we carry, the part of us that remains powerful, dangerous, and necessary, no matter how much we try to silence it. The uncanny pull of Medusa ensures that she will always return, not just in art and literature, but in psychology, philosophy, and personal imagination. To think of her is to confront the deep paradoxes of fear, that what we dread most also fascinates us most, that what we repress returns most powerfully, and that the face we cannot bear to look at is often our own. And this is why Medusa has been reborn in modern times, not just as a figure of fear, but as an icon of resistance, a face carried proudly rather than hidden away.
Her psychological depth, her uncanny fascination, and her contradictions prepared her for a new life in a world where myths are reinterpreted not only as symbols of dread, but as sources of empowerment. To follow her story further, we must see how the Gorgon, once demonized and slain, became an emblem of survival and defiance in the modern age.
For centuries, Medusa was remembered as the monster slain by Perseus, her head mounted on Athena's shield, her image carved into stone as a warning. But in the modern era, something unexpected happened. The very figure that once embodied horror became a symbol of power. The woman cursed and silenced, demonized and decapitated, was reborn as an icon of resistance, survival, and defiance. From literature and art to politics and activism, Medusa has been reclaimed as one of the most potent symbols of feminist imagination. The seeds of this transformation can be found in the 19th century, when Romantic and later symbolist artists began to see Medusa not only as a monster, but as a figure of tragic beauty. Painters like Arnold Böcklin and sculptors like Antonio Canova depicted her head not as grotesque, but as strangely compelling, a mixture of horror and sorrow. The snakes remain, but the expression is almost human, almost mournful. In these works, Medusa is no longer only the villain of the myth, she is a victim, punished unfairly, transformed into something terrifying against her will. This shift in representation prepared the ground for her feminist rebirth. The decisive turn came in the 20th century. Writers and thinkers began to see in Medusa's story the outline of a broader cultural pattern, the demonization of women's power and sexuality. Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, pointed to the ways myths like Medusa's cast women as monstrous whenever they defied patriarchal control. Hélène Cixous, in her influential 1975 essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, made the case even more directly. She argued that the horror of Medusa was not real but projected, a male fantasy that turned women's bodies into symbols of dread. She's not deadly, Cixous wrote. She's beautiful, and she's laughing. For Cixous, to reclaim Medusa was to reclaim female voice, sexuality, and creativity from centuries of repression. This reclamation resonated powerfully in feminist movements. Medusa became the symbol of women refusing silence, refusing to be shamed, refusing to be turned into objects of fear.
Her petrifying gaze, once imagined as a curse, was reinterpreted as the power of defiance, the look that refuses to submit, the stare that returns male power back upon itself. The very features that once defined her as monstrous, her serpents, her gaze, her rage, were now celebrated as emblems of strength. Artists followed suit. In the 1970s and 1980s, Medusa appeared in feminist art as a symbol of empowerment. She was painted not as grotesque, but as radiant, her snakes woven into crowns, her eyes blazing with defiance. Sculptures and installations reimagined her as a guardian rather than a monster, a figure standing watch over women's spaces and struggles. Literature, too, began to retell her story from her own perspective, shifting sympathy away from Perseus and toward the Gorgon herself. The political power of Medusa's image became clear in movements against sexual violence. Her story of a woman assaulted by a god, punished instead of protected, silenced and demonized, spoke directly to the experiences of women confronting patriarchal systems that blamed victims rather than perpetrators. Medusa's face became a symbol of rage against injustice, her snakes the embodiment of female anger long suppressed. To embrace Medusa was to reject the demand for silence, to claim the right to fury. This symbolism erupted vividly in contemporary art. One of the most striking examples is Luciano Garbati's 2008 sculpture Medusa with the head of Perseus. In a deliberate reversal of the classical trope, Garbati shows Medusa standing tall, holding Perseus's severed head in her hand. Unlike traditional depictions, she is calm, composed, and unapologetic. The piece went largely unnoticed until 2018, when it was embraced by activists in the now Me Too movement as a symbol of justice and reversal. Images of the statue spread widely, turning Medusa into an emblem of women reclaiming power from those who had long silenced them. In popular culture too, Medusa has been reborn. She appears in novels, films and comics, not only as a monster, but as a misunderstood or tragic figure.
In Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, she is a villain, but also a victim of her curse. In comics like Wonder Woman, her image is reinterpreted as part of a pantheon of female power. Even in fashion, Medusa has been claimed as an icon. The Versace logo, featuring her head, has become one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, celebrated as an emblem of allure, danger, and independence. What unites these diverse reinterpretations is a shift in perspective. Where ancient myth looked at Medusa through the eyes of Perseus, modern culture increasingly looks at her through her own. Her story is no longer about a hero's triumph, but about a woman's survival. She is not only the monster, but the mirror, reflecting the ways cultures construct fear out of female power. To reclaim her is to challenge those constructions, to insist that what was once demonized can become sacred again. Psychologically, this reclamation also speaks to the deeper power of the Medusa archetype. She represents the shadow, the repressed, the silenced. To embrace her is to embrace those parts of the self that patriarchy has demanded be hidden: female rage, sexuality, independence, refusal. This is why she resonates so strongly with feminist movements. She is not simply a mythic figure, but a symbol of what has been denied. Her rebirth is a refusal to accept that denial any longer. At the same time, Medusa's modern role highlights how myths evolve with culture.
For the Greeks, she was the embodiment of dread, a monster to be slain. For the Romans, she became an imperial emblem. For medieval Europe, she was a demon, a symbol of sin. But for the modern age, she has become a voice, a face that speaks not of silence, but of power. Each era has seen in her what it most fears or desires. Her rebirth as a feminist icon is part of this ongoing process, proof that myths never die. They are always reborn, reshaped, reinterpreted. The image of Medusa laughing, celebrated by Sixers, captures this perfectly. Once, her face was carved into stone to terrify, her gaze used as a weapon by gods and heroes. Now, she is imagined as laughing, joyous, free. What was once horror becomes liberation. The snakes that once marked her curse now mark her crown. The gaze that once petrified now resists domination. The head that was once severed now stands tall, unbowed. Medusa's rebirth does not erase her past, it acknowledges it. She was cursed, demonized and slain, but she survived in image and story. To reclaim her is to reclaim all those women silenced by myth, history and culture. She becomes their voice, their symbol, their guardian. She is no longer the monster in the shadows. She is the icon in the light. And yet, even in this modern rebirth, Medusa retains her uncanny ambiguity. She is still dangerous, still unsettling, still a figure who resists easy domestication. This is part of her power.
She cannot be reduced to victim or goddess, horror or heroine. She remains both, always both. That ambiguity is what makes her endure, what makes her continually available for new meanings. She is the face that cannot be silenced, the gaze that cannot be turned away. As the modern world reclaims Medusa, it also confronts the fears that made her in the first place. Fears of the feminine, fears of sexuality, fears of rage. To embrace her is to face those fears and transform them. The monster becomes the protector, the cursed becomes the crowned. The story turns inside out, and in the turning, Medusa is reborn. Her journey is not yet finished. Even now, artists, activists, and thinkers continue to reinterpret her. Each new generation finds in her face a reflection of its own struggles, its own fears, its own hopes. She will not vanish, because she never has. From temple stones to feminist manifestos, from shields to sculptures, Medusa endures, always changing, always reborn. And as her rebirth unfolds, we are left with one final question. What does it mean to face her now, in our own age? To answer that, we must return to her gaze, to the invitation of the Gorgon, and to what it asks of us, not to turn away, but to look directly, to face what we fear, and to find in it the possibility of transformation. To stand before Medusa is to confront one of the most enduring images in human imagination. For more than 2,000 years, her face has stared back at us, on temple stones, on coins, on shields, in poetry, in paintings, in sculpture, in literature, in psychology, in political movements. She has been monster, protector, victim, goddess, symbol, and icon. But at the heart of all these roles is the same experience, the confrontation with fear. To meet her eyes is to face what terrifies us, what paralyzes us, what we would rather not see. The invitation of the Gorgon is simple and absolute. Look, and do not look away. The myths told us that to see her directly was death, that no mortal could withstand her gaze. Perseus survived only by looking indirectly through the reflection of a polished shield. That detail has never lost its power. It tells us something essential about the nature of fear. We cannot always face it head-on. Sometimes we need reflection, mediation, a way of approaching indirectly. But even then, the encounter is unavoidable. Perseus cannot defeat Medusa without seeing her, however mediated. Likewise, we cannot overcome our fears without facing them, even if we use mirrors of art, therapy, or storytelling. Medusa's invitation is to confront fear, but not to rush into it blindly. Her myth warns us of the danger of direct sight, of being overwhelmed, petrified, frozen. But it also shows us the necessity of sight, the way reflection makes confrontation possible. This is why her story has been retold in so many ways. It is not only a myth about gods and heroes, but a myth about the human condition, about how we deal with the things that terrify and fascinate us. To face Medusa is to face contradiction. She is both victim and monster, cursed and crowned, protector and destroyer, beautiful and grotesque. She embodies the ambiguity that human beings find hardest to accept, that things can be both at once, that fear and power, horror and healing can coexist. The invitation of the Gorgon is to accept this ambiguity, to resist the temptation to simplify. To see her is to acknowledge that fear and fascination are inseparable, that the monstrous often hides the sacred, that what we dread most may also be what we most need to face. Throughout history, cultures have answered this invitation in different ways. The Greeks made her a monster and then placed her face on temples to guard the sacred. The Romans turned her into an imperial emblem. Medieval Europe demonized her as an image of sin. Renaissance artists painted her as tragic beauty. Psychoanalysts saw her as the mirror of the mind. Feminists reclaimed her as an icon of defiance. Each response reflects not only Medusa, but ourselves, our fears, our structures, our anxieties, our desires. The Gorgon does not change alone. We change, and in changing, we see her differently. Her endurance proves that the invitation she offers is one we cannot refuse.
We are drawn to her again and again, compelled to retell her story, to reinterpret her image. We cannot look away, even though to look is to risk petrification. This paradox is her greatest power. She traps us in the act of looking, forces us to recognize our own fascination with fear. In modern times, her invitation has become sharper. When artists reclaim Medusa as a feminist icon, they are asking us to face the injustices buried in her myth, the silencing of victims, the demonization of women's power, the appropriation of fear by patriarchal structures. To embrace Medusa now is to face not only personal fears, but cultural ones, to see in her gaze the reflection of systems that must be challenged. Her invitation is no longer only individual but collective, a call to look directly at structures of violence and oppression and refuse to be petrified into silence. But the invitation is also personal. To dream of Medusa, to imagine her, to look at her in art or story, is to engage with our own inner shadows. She embodies the things we repress: rage, shame, vulnerability, sexuality, mortality. To see her is to see those parts of ourselves reflected back. The petrification she offers is not just death, but the paralysis of denial, the freezing that comes when we refuse to face what is within us. Her challenge is to move through that paralysis, to look indirectly if necessary, to hold the mirror up to ourselves and to emerge not destroyed, but transformed.
This is why the Gorgon's invitation is so enduring. It is not about slaying monsters, but about confronting what monsters represent. Perseus' story is not the end of Medusa, it is the beginning of ours. For in every age we create new Medusas, images of what we fear, what we demonize, what we repress. And in every age we are challenged to face them, to ask whether the monster is truly out there or within us. The power of her story lies in its refusal to give us easy answers. Medusa is never just one thing. She is always layered, always ambivalent, always more than any single interpretation. That is why she can be reborn again and again as goddess, monster, protector, victim, icon. To face her is to face complexity itself, the complexity we so often try to reduce or deny. Her invitation is to accept it, to live with it, to let it transform us. Perhaps this is why her face continues to fascinate. Whether carved in stone on a Greek temple or reimagined in modern art, it speaks directly to something universal. The wide eyes, the writhing snakes, the half-human, half-other face. It is the image of fear made visible, but also the image of resilience. To look at her is to feel both dread and awe, to recognize that fear itself is part of what makes us human. The final irony of Medusa is that though she was cursed to petrify others, she herself has never been petrified. She has never been frozen into one meaning. She moves across cultures, shifts through time, adapts to each new context. She is the most fluid of figures, even as she is imagined as stone. The invitation of the Gorgon is not to be turned to stone, but to move with her, to allow her shifting meanings to teach us about our own. And so, at the end of her long story, what remains is not only horror or tragedy, but the challenge she offers. Do we turn away, afraid of what we might see? Or do we accept the invitation, look into the mirror, and confront what lies within and around us? The Greeks told us that to meet her gaze directly was impossible, but perhaps the true lesson is not avoidance, but courage, to look, to reflect, to face the fears that shape us. Medusa endures because we need her. We need a face that embodies our contradictions, a story that forces us to grapple with fear, injustice, and transformation. She is the monster who is never only a monster, the goddess who is never only divine, the victim who is never only silent. She is the mirror of our minds and our cultures, the reflection we cannot escape. To accept her invitation is to accept the truth of being human, that fear will always accompany us, but that in facing it, we may find strength, healing, and even liberation. Medusa, the Gorgon, the goddess in exile, still stands before us, her gaze unbroken, her snakes alive. She waits, as she always has, for us to decide whether to look away or to meet her eyes.